before we begin, several weeks ago, and it might have been 3 weeks ago, we were electronically emailed a draft water utility study. And if any of you studied it as intently as Councilor Brown did, you realize that that draft was a draft, and there's been some slight change between what you saw then and what you see today. But the premise is still basically the same. We have two people with us who have conducted the water study, Jerry Eisner in blue and Blaine Rooney. And I've spoken with them briefly. Blaine's going to start and they'll do their introductions. And they've got lots of experience in doing this. So we're all going to be educated at the end of this session. So before we begin, there is a motion. Yeah.
No, it's later on.
Later on. Okay, let's go.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Thanks for inviting us this morning to present the water rate study. My name is Blaine Rooney, and my colleague Jerry Eisner. We do about the majority of these for the province, for the water utilities in the province. Water utilities in Nova Scotia are regulated by the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board through the Public Utilities Act. So they're the ones that set the rates. So we apply, set their rates. The council of this municipality is essentially the board of directors of the municipality of Queens water utility. So the process we do is we work with staff and we put together basically a three-year business plan, capital and operating for the water utility. And then we submit that to we submit it to the council, which is why we're here today. And if the council agrees that it should go ahead, then pass a motion and we'll file it with the utility review board. Just our background, my background, I'm a CPA, CA. I worked with Halifax Water for 27 years. The past 25 years as Director of Finance and Customer Service. Jerry's background is, he's an engineer. He was a consulting engineer with one of the engineering companies and did a lot of work with municipalities. And we've been doing this, I've been doing it for 11 years after I mostly retired, and Jerry's been doing it longer than that. So we've been through this road before. We do some work in New Brunswick and PEI, but the vast majority of it is in Nova Scotia. So the process is that the board, as I said, once we submit this to the utility review board, they take control of the process, and we lose. And what'll happen generally is we'll get some information. They'll look at it, and we'll get a schedule of events. One of which will be that they'll issue us somewhere between 30 and 50 information requests. So they'll pick apart this thing with weeds, and a lot of the questions, what comes out of it will, so we'll have to respond to them. And they'll schedule a public hearing. Before COVID, they would come here. And I suspect they may come back here once this is over. The hearings we've had within the last year have all been done virtually. But the process is the same. We have interveners and all that. You can respond, you can formally apply, and they'll have a public hearing, and then they'll issue a decision in due course. That whole process from the time we file the application usually takes about 6 months. So effectively, we're looking to get rates to begin on April 1st of next year, which is the start of your fiscal year. So I think that's all. Much of an introduction, and I'll turn it over to Jerry to hit the highlights.
Okay, I'm doing water rate studies could put many people to sleep, including myself at times. What I will do is I'm going to run through the water rate study and try to pick up the points that are most pertinent to setting the rates and why rates are set the way they are, so that you have an understanding of that. And to do that, I realize you all have a copy of it, so I'm going to refer to page numbers. Okay, it's your section 3.2, I'm gonna refer to page numbers, and the very first page number I'm gonna refer you to is page 9. Okay, there's, you know, some of this, as you will see, as Blaine says, the hearing process is semi-judicial, so that some of it is process-driven, and we will bore you to tears with that. We're trying to get down to the meat of it all. What this page does, which we call worksheet B1, the board tells us what to call it. It indicates what will happen to the water utility if you do not change rates, okay? So it's not based on the new rates, it's based on your existing rates. Okay, so there's a few things to realize would happen. One is that if you go down and go up 4 lines from the bottoms, you'll have what's called excess or deficiency in brackets, revenue over expenditures. And you can see that in the current year, we're looking at a $21,000 deficit the current year that's going on, the 2021 year. But without a change in rates, that will grow to 91,000 next year, to 94,000 the year after, to 117,000 the year after that. So you can see that there's just reason for you to get in there and get your rates. Now, on that same page, that the 3 lines up from the bottom, you'll see that you're setting a rather a good surplus. Okay, you burned up some money, you held it in an account. Some of it is due to be placed in a reserve account, which we're going to apply for during this hearing process for the filter backwash at the water treatment plant. It's been built up over the years, about $80,000 that needs to be moved over to that account. Because those sorts of reserve accounts require board approval, and we didn't have it, so it's been just sitting there in the surplus account. And as well, you'll see that there's what's referred to in the economic world as a balloon payment, i.e. you have a loan payment coming due that the financing was for 10 years, and the balance is $245,604. And what we're going to do is take that out of your surplus account and not refinance that. So that cuts down on your capital debt, and also it'll leave you sitting in pretty good shape in your surplus account, or your surplus at year end, in much better shape than most utilities we work on, which all too often I'm looking at down there and I see negative signs all across the board. So that's just to give you an indication, but the most important thing on this page, and the thing that the board will be interested in, is that without a rate adjustment, you're going to lose some serious money coming up in the next 3 years, in the order of, $300,000. And yes.
How comes it goes from like 21,000 to 91 now?
You'll see that some of the expenditures we're planning are relating to, especially on account for what we call non-revenue water, which is water that's treated and not processed and not sold. It's leaked out of the system. It's either gone. Some of it we refer to as non-revenue. Some of it's accounted for, like we know that they flush hydrants, they flush mains, that's all accounted for. Then there's a whole series out that's what we refer to as unaccounted for, which is basically leakage. And some of your pipe network, especially your transmission main coming in from the lake, is dating back to the 1890s, and let's just say that some of the joints are leaking. And I'm guessing, but I suspect there's a joint every 4 to 5 feet in that old pipe with lead open, and so to fix it would be a monumental task. So it's actually being replaced, and that's scheduled in here. That's some of the expenditures that drive that price up. Okay.
Is that a well over there? That's part of the system too, isn't it?
The well is not part of the system. It's not part of the utility. No.
No, I guess not. That's just a straight well.
Yeah, no, it is not considered part of the utility. It doesn't deliver water to any of your customers.
Okay.
On a fee basis. Okay, so that sets the stage as to why we're here. Okay, that's the first thing. Next thing I'm going to do is refer you to page 11, which is an answer to your question about where the expenses are going. We've worked extensively with Adam and Joanne, and Adam have worked a lot in the background without us, getting some of your accounts, shall we say, more correctly allocated. We found some of the accounts were not allocated as judiciously as they could have been, and we figured the board was going to question us extensively on it, so that task was taken on, and what we've done is made the allocations, adjusted them to make them more alignment with the actual expenditure centers. The cost centers in some cases were perhaps under administration, and they should have been under transmission and distribution, and all those things have been adjusted, put back in order. And that's why you'll see some of the expense items, like even in first of all, source of supply, there was no money allocated to that. It was actually all carried some results in the system. But there is a source of supply. You have a lake intake, you have screens, all those things have to be maintained. By the board's rules, if it's there and you're spending money on it, you should have a cost center for it. And so we're setting up a cost center with your staff. We're going to set one up to source of supply. It's not a huge item, it's around $10,000 or $11,000 a year. But we'll keep that out there in the forefront, and perhaps, it makes it easier to manage from a management point of view. On this areas of water treatment, you'll see that the costs are increasing in some areas. Some of this was due to the reallocation of some of the labor, especially where labor was not necessarily allocated directly to the utility, but after a review, it was found that this is certainly in the case here, it's 35,000 for a couple of years, that goes to 62. The 62 in our minds is much more comparable to what we find in other utilities. Running water treatment plants of this size would be $60,000 to $80,000 a year in labor to do that. So this is, as I said, we consider this perhaps a more correct allocation. In general, across the board, what we've allocated and what we've included is about a 3% per year increase. And in the case of water treatment, it is 3% per year. There's no magic in that number, except that the UARB has adopted that as being a reasonable thing. Now, when you set water rates, we set them at what we call zero budgeting. So we have no contingency fund anywhere. So if we say it's going to cost this much and it costs more, then we're in a deficit position. So they give us a little leeway in a couple of spots, and one of them is the 3% rule. We call it inflationary, but inflation's been 1.5% to 2%. So we pick up a point, which is not a whole lot of money, but $3,000 in contingency is better than no contingency. And that's essentially what's going on with that. Now, in the next one, transmission and distribution, there's a whole new item there. It's about 5 lines up from the bottom. It's called leak detection. This is starting a different program for you, and that is we talked to the engineering staff. I explained to them that the UARB is very keen on looking at non-revenue water. And in your case right now, you're treating about twice as much water as you're selling. Okay, so you produce 100,000 cubic meters and you sell 50,000, or whatever the number is. But that's basically where you're at. Now, some of that we can account for. There's water being put out to what we call bleeders, which is to maintain the chlorine levels. And you have long dead end pipes, and they don't consume enough water. So you have to let the water flow to keep the chlorine levels high enough to ensure it meets the public health standard. So that's a bleeder. They flush mains, we know that. We also know the fire department, we charge them for it. But if there's a fire or if they're practicing, they hook onto the hydrants and they use water. That's all accounted for. What's unaccounted for is the leakage. And since yours is rather, it's in the higher end of the scale in the province. It's normally, for a utility this age, it'd probably be 20 to 25 to maybe even 30% of unaccounted for. But right now you're at close to 50 to 60%. So we're putting in a new little program called leak detection, which starts out with someone coming in and doing a really detailed listen. Believe it or not, they do it acoustically, and they listen for leaks. And a good leak detection guy is, I tell them about, they're like violin players that can tell you how big the leak is and possibly where it's at. So they will listen through. That's the first year, and then what you'll see in years 2 and 3 is like a maintenance program. You have that same person come back. You fix the leaks, they come back and they check and they say, okay, that's fine, you fix those. Guess what? You got a new one over here. This never stops. It's like the laundry. You can do it all you want, and next year you'll have more leaks. Okay, because it's pipelines in the street, there's heavy trucks on the road, pipes are old, they're failing, there's a lock laying on them that shouldn't be there, there's a whole number of things. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons why your expenses are going up. It's some of that's reallocation or correcting the allocation of labor, and the other one, certainly in this case, is the direct cost of $25,000 that first year. So that one, goes up actually 8% in the first year, goes down 2% in the second year because of that little bump in there. And then about 4, and then finally admin in general, and again here, this is one where, Joanna's looked at the allocations of staff internally, how much time is actually spent doing water billings and collecting information, getting those accounts and collecting it all back and that sort of thing. And, we've come up with budgets, and these are in the 3% per year range, each one of them. So that's the breakdown of all of those expenses that were used. And we're now gonna use those expenses to generate, our rates. Now, on top of that, that's all operating, we have capital, and that happens on page 13, 14, 15, and 16. And what we do is we simply take the capital program that staff have brought forward, and we insert it into these tables, and as we do that, we calculate A, how we're gonna pay for it, and B, what the depreciation is on that asset that we have to add to our depreciation fund, amortization fund that we're collecting to replace the system. So, in the case of the very first page, page 13, there's expenditures is $355,100. At the middle of the page there, there's, it says at the bottom, there's $89,100, either from outside funding, it's either CWWF and gas tax. And the balance of it, we're gonna take out of your depreciation fund. You currently have about $1,059,000 sitting in your depreciation fund that you've accumulated over the years. It was put in for the intention of doing and repairing and replacing things. And so, as you'll see in that calculation, we're saying at the end of the year, the end of that year, we're predicting you'll have about $913,000 in that depreciation fund. And we do that same thing for each year. The next page is the 22, 23, 23, 24, if you go to page 16, it's 24, 25, and you'll see that we put in a fair bit of money, $250,000 a year on the transmission main. That's to attack some of this leaking problem that we know we're gonna find, on the old transmission main, and get it replaced, and put new tighter piping in there. And you'll also see that we're spending some depreciation each year. We're putting more in every year, of course, but we spend it. And so you'll end up with, we're thinking with the depreciation fund in the order of $500,000 at the end of your 3-year term, which is still a very healthy depreciation fund. Some utilities actually run on the principle that they can keep very little there. They just have to keep spending it because there's so many pipes in the ground in Nova Scotia that require replacement. Most of our systems are old, okay? They're older towns, older communities. There's always more demand than there is money, in simple terms. Okay, so, but we've gone through all 3 of these years without any borrowing, and you're spending $350 or $350 in that range, $350, $375 each year on replacing pipes without any borrowing, any new borrowing in the water utility. So that all gets added in, the depreciation gets added in, we look at that. The next thing we do, after we've done all that, now we figure out how much things are gonna cost. We go to page 21, and the water utility sells literally to the municipality fire protection services, because a water utility under the Public Utilities Act is to deliver water to customers. It's not to fight fires. So the very first thing we have to do is calculate how much the fire department, or the municipality, in this case, it's not the fire department, the municipality owes the water utility to provide that service. And if you think of it, a reservoir in most systems, about 1/3 of a reservoir's general knowledge, not specific to your location, but about 1/3 of a reservoir's capacity is actually to provide water to customers, and 2/3 is to fight fires. Okay? Because when a customer opens the tap or flushes the toilet, not much water flows. When the fire department hooks on, it's big time, okay? So that's the rough rule, the old engineering rule. If I had to guess it, sending my days gone by, I'd say, okay, 30, maybe 40%, most, that sort of thing. So what we do is we take all of the utility plant and service, again, this is board directed, each asset, and we allocate them either to fire protection or to what we call general service or delivery of water to the customers. And I tell everybody there's two extremes, and one is a water meter, which when you have a fire is really useless. So it goes 100% to delivery of water and nothing to the customer. Or 100%, yeah, to the customer and nothing to the fire protection. And the opposite end of the scale is a hydrant, which really does nothing to deliver water to a house, but it does a great deal to fight fire. So it goes 100% fire protection, 0% to residential. Most everything else falls 90% to general service or delivery of water and 10% to fire, because even when the fire is on, the water treatment plant does contribute some. It's still making water, still sending it into the system. But you'll find that the key items in here are reservoirs and transmission piping, street piping. They actually go 40% to delivering water to a customer and 60% to fire. Because in general, that's the sizing of how the sizing of those pipes happen. A 10-inch pipe in the street is usually never required for delivery to customers. It's there to simply deliver a lot of water to a fire, especially in a downtown area. So we do all those allocations and we arrive at percentages, a mixed percentage from all of the assets that the utility has. We do that for each year. That's pages 21 through 22, 23. We take those percentages and we insert them into our expense tables that we generated by going through all the accounts. And we do that on page 25. And we take sources 5, 10%, again, for fighting fires, because it's there, it's going to generate something. Same with water treatment, 10%. Transmission and distribution, we use our calculated amount, which in your case is 41.7, and so on. Now, we have done a little bit of footwork here that the board allows us to do. Your existing fire protection rate is $197,235. If I follow the formula exactly in the first year, the fire protection rate would be $187, increasing in the second year and going up to $195,474. What we're asking the board to do, because it still offers the municipality a good rate, we're asking them to allow you to set the fire protection rate at the rate that's calculated for the third year, for the first 2 years. So that has the effect of lowering the amount of money we need to get from the customer directly. It also, in our mind, the 187 to 195 is not a huge hit on the municipality, and you're going to lower it down back up to 195 anyway. So we'll ask them to do this. We've done this in a number of other utilities. They've always been in agreement with it, that it's a good way to go about it. And it does impact, like I said, what it does is it reduces the impact on our rates for customers in that first year. So in essence, what we're asking for them on this table is that we set the rates at $195,474 for each of the 3 years. And we follow the formula only for the third year, is the one that's only really based on the formula. The other one I did some magic math on and come up with a formula that works. Me and my friends at Excel. So that's what we're asking. That's one thing we're asking them to do. Like I said, the reason is that it's for setting up the rates for the customers to get them as low as we can. The next table I'll send you to is page 27. On it, what we do is we allocate expenses, the required expenses. So first we take the total revenue that we got from our first page, which is all of those things that we calculated, plus our depreciation, plus a budgeted amount for taxes, a budgeted amount for depreciation, and we put that in a formula and we say, okay, how much of this can we get from base? We have some pretty strict guidelines from the board. We can ask them to bend them a bit. What we're asking them to do in your case is to set your base rate at around 40% of your total revenue. So the reason we do that is a financial security thing, because it may fall lower than that. You're a small utility. If you lost one big customer, lost some big sales, you could lose some money in a hurry. So we try to keep the base, which you get paid regardless of whether the customer uses water or not, at some reasonable level. Sometimes a really small utility will set it at closer to 50 to 55%. In your case, we think 40 is good given your customer base. So we're asking the board to do that at 40%, which means that 60% of the revenue that you'll get comes from selling water. So if water sales go up, you're okay. If water sales go down, not so okay. But you do have a little bit of surplus account there, so you can stand a little bump around. We didn't see anything that caused us to think that you were gonna lose water sales. We just try to build a little bit of defense in there in case something strange happens. So that's how we divvy up the revenue required from base and that. Then what we start with on page 28 is all the customers you have. You have 2 unmetered services, 1,159 5/8" customers, and so on down the list, for a total of 1,225 customers right now. For anyone's interest sake, you had 1,138 in 2002. So you've come up 87 customers since that time. We are not adding in any growth into this projection this time around. The reason for that is that we add growth in, it's built into the formula that it'll automatically generate revenue. And if you don't get growth, then you're going to end up short of money. It's basically the bottom line. And we talked to staff, there was nothing that they saw on the horizon that was absolutely certain that we were going to have 4 new units this year and next year and the year after. And we impress upon it, but blaming the accountant, especially that be absolutely certain that we're gonna have that revenue, because we're gonna count it as revenue if you put growth in it. And if you build it in and you don't get it, then you just end up in a deficit position. So there's that, we do that for every year. Needless to say, in this case, it doesn't change much. Then we use a formula to generate the base rates. And in that's on page 30. We use a thing called the capacity ratio. There is an organization that is the father of all rules in the water business. It's the American Water Works Association, AWWA, for those that are in the acronym world. But they generate and do testing on many things. One of them is they check the capacity of every meter versus a 5/8" meter. So the rule is you take 5/8 as being 1, and you say, okay, how much more water can I put through a 4" meter than I can put through a 5/8? And the testing indicates it's 25 times as much water. So when we set base rates under the utility system, we set the base rates to reflect mostly, not totally, but mostly your ability to take water. It's very similar to electrical power, where if you have a 100-amp service coming into your home, you pay a base rate. If you have a 500-amp service or a 1,000-amp service, you're running a business, you'll pay a much higher base rate because you have the ability to take more out of the system. So therefore, the system has to be built to do that. So that's exactly how water rates are set. So you'll find that a 4-inch, like a 4-inch customer charge is, basically $3,785 a year, and 5/8" or standard household meter is $157 a year. And that's the reason why they're different. It's because of that capacity. They have the capacity to take more water. So we do that for each meter, and we generate a meter rate. We then take look at how much water you sold in the last year. In your case, you sold 290,626 cubic meters, and most of that went to your 5/8" your residential meters. I do a check every time to see whether or not your residential customers are reducing their consumption, because we are seeing that in some areas. Some of that is aging population. In other words, there's not as many people living in the home. In other cases, it's driven by more efficient water devices, water using devices, low cost toilets, front-loading washers, and things like that. Are really dramatically. In your case, the interesting thing was in 2002, you used 150 cubic meters per customer per year, and this last year you used 149 cubic meters per customer per year. So we didn't build any decline into your consumption. We're leaving it set as it is, but there's no evidence to suggest it should be going down. Now, when we get the new water rates in, hopefully it holds up, but they hold there at the current level. I believe it will, because I don't think we're seeing a dramatic change in rates. So that's fair. That's how much water we're selling each year. Remember, we divided up how much money we needed from base, how much we needed from water sales. water sales, we just simply do, you know, how much money we need and how much water we're selling, and it comes out at $1.21 per cubic meter. It currently is 96 cents per cubic meter, and that changes in year 2 to $1.24, it's page 32, and then goes to $1.28 for the final year. So those are the calculated consumption rates. All of that gets carried forward, and I'll do that now. On page 35, we were asked by engineering staff for planning on building a wholesale meter for truckers to load up water. So we calculated a rate on page 35 for the sale of bulk water sales, which is again a formula from the board. So it basically raises the price up from that $1.21 because it includes everything, the metering, the setting up of the facility and everything else. Goes up to more like $3.60, $3.75 cubic meter for those, that service to provide that necessary infrastructure and that servicing. The table that most councils are most interested in is page 36. It is a comparison of the average bill, okay? So to get an average bill, we just take the total number of customers, divide it into how much water was used by that customer class, back to those two tables where we had the 157,000, whatever it was, cubic meters for the residential customers, we divide by the number of customers, and we end up with around 37 cubic meters. And to do that, that sees your first year change of about 12.8%. Now, that's getting up there, but the fact of the matter is, your last rate adjustment was April 1st, 2004. Okay, so you've got a few years under the belt. I'm amazed, to be honest with you, that it come out that low. I really was when I was through it. It speaks well for how well the treatment system and things are running. Because I really thought you were going to be hit with a doozy, to be honest. Not that I was looking forward to that, because that's always, the board always has a rougher time with those. Anyway, that's the first year. You go to the second part of the table, you see that the rate increase is very modest. It's 0.4% for the residential customers. And in the following years, it's 3.9% for residential customers. Now, some of that in the first and second years is because we changed that fire protection rates. We pulled those rates down a bit. And then we have to catch up in that final year. We all push that to, eventually we have to catch up sooner or somewhere, so we do it in the third next year. But overall, you're seeing increases on a quarterly basis of about $9.60 the first year, which is in the range of $3.20 a month, which is incredibly low for a product that you have delivered to your house under pressure, treated and tested to meet government standards. So we looked at that. I'll let that one go by. Next, what we did is we looked at all of your schedules, schedule for rates and charges, which is, we'll start with on page 41. Primarily what we did here is we discussed these with staff, and obviously it was written in 2002. Costs have changed a bit. So we have adjusted all of the cost figures in them to reflect what's considered normal in the industry, and certainly it appears to be that your staff and your agreements with staff about charging time after hours and things like that are similar to others. But basically, the current charges are going from, for water supply from hydrants, it's $25. It's includes sending the man out and doing it, and so that's up to $70. That's again more than the provincial average. And for other charges, it's basically $60 for call-outs on regular hours and $200 for after hours. Now, most utilities don't get any call-outs for after hours once they implement a charge that's actually reflective of what it costs. Because most areas on a Sunday night or a holiday, you have to pay your staff for a minimum number of hours if they go and provide service. So we've done that for all of the charges through the system. We have put in what we call a May charge for missed appointments by customers. It didn't appear to be a major problem here, but it's certainly a very common one in the province. and that is that, if someone's just chronically phones up and keeps saying, well, this is wrong, that's wrong, could you go check, could you go check, could you go check? You just say you may charge them up to $50 if you feel that the calls are really driven by something other than the water system. The last thing we have there, which is page 43, is the bulk water rate. So it was $3.63 for any kind, with a minimum charge of $50. Now, the minimum charge is quite common in most areas. In areas where we haven't had it, we've had some rather, I wouldn't say bad experiences, but yeah, I would say it's the bad experiences. We've had people show up with like 2-gallon jugs and turn the spigot on. The thing is geared to send out a lot of water in a hurry, and it really hasn't turned out well. The jugs all over the yard and people chasing them, and this is really meant for bulk water hauls. It's not meant for people going out to get a gallon of water. Okay, so it's a bulk water station. It's gonna have a bulk water meter set up on it. It's gonna deliver a lot of water in a hurry. It's not meant for someone showing up with 2 5-gallon totes and saying, I need 10 gallons of water. So the minimum charge is placed in for that reason, to try to push it to the truckers away from the residential users. If someone wants residential water, they really should consider going over to Sobeys or Superstore or something. Who will refill your bottle. That kind of place. So that was done. We do that for each year. Your 3 years of your rate study is Billings is the 3-year business plan. So we set rates, which we've talked about how they were set. We do that for each year. And we end up with schedule what we call A, B, and C. And then we end up with schedule D, which is page 51. In this case here, it's fair to say that your schedule D, the rules and regulations of the utility, were significantly out of date with what the current board is requesting that we include, and it seeks for every utility to have some minimum sets of rules on. So we made a lot of adjustments, more than I can go through at any one time, but all of them are based on just bringing the water utility up to the current expectations of the health utilities board review of what they expect. Now, some of them you may think are not necessary, but we put them all in. If you don't use them, there's no harm. If it shows up that someone does do something really, especially really dumb, and that's probably true, because that's what we get occasionally, then the rules are there for you to help you adjust that situation, and it gives staff, and certainly your engineering staff, your CAO staff, it gives them the tools to be able to adjudicate these things under rules that are authorized and enforced under the Public Utilities Act. So we did add a couple of new ones to the end. Basically, we just simply request for extensions. I don't believe it was there. We just simply said the utility has no obligation to extend water service. You have to realize that you don't have to extend water service, but you will review every request for an extension individually, and you'll make a decision accordingly. So the other one is, work on utility infrastructure is restricted to utility staff, and not some guy with think we can just dig it up and start doing things. It's yours. The other thing is curb stop that will allow this, that's in your front lawn in most places. We find that people, this is chronic everywhere in the province. People bury them, they put flower gardens on top of them, they pave their driveway on top of them, put concrete sidewalks on top of them. The rule is that little curb stop belongs to you, because it's on public property. And it's your way to turn the water on and off. And if they do all those things, then you have to dig it up, and somebody has to pay the freight. Any extra costs that you did by putting things there, and you can't necessarily put them all back. You also pave the driveway and on top of it. It's exposed to the air for a reason, just because you want to have access to it. Anyway, those are sort of the highlights. Setting water rates, I probably went on longer than I should have in there, and
I just a couple of comments that Jerry said. The first year, there's probably 12% increase in water rates. If you go back to the first page, if you looked at page 9, where it says basically if we don't increase rates, we're gonna raise $91,000 this next fiscal year. The way the Public Act works, that's a hole, and we have to crawl into the hole in the first year. So you have to generate $91,000 more on $700,000 worth of revenue, so that's more than 10%. So that's why that adjustment is as big as it is the first year. You have to crawl into the hole, and that's why we talk to a lot of utilities about, don't, when you see yourself go into deficit, then it's right, because, the old fellow saying is, the first thing you should do when you're in a hole is stop digging. So you have to crawl into that hole, so that's the reason, the main reason why the big increase first year. The second point, I'd just like to, just reiterate, when Jerry was talking about the difference between the base and the consumption rate, what we're trying to do is have that delicate balance of trying to make sure the utility is protected, so 40% of your revenue you're gonna get when you're hooked up. Having spent a lot of years in the utility business, there's very few expenses that are variable in the water utility. Sales drop 10%, you maybe use less chemicals and a little less power, but you still gotta have the stock, you still gotta have all the equipment. But by having the 60% of the rate structure based on consumption, customers can influence their bill. So if they reduce their water use, their bill will go down, no question. So that's how we try to get that balance in there that protects the utility, but also allows customers to influence their bill.
The last thing I'll draw your attention to is the handout that arrived this morning, which is a comparison of your rates with everybody else in the province based on your consumption. And you are in excellent shape. I don't know how else to tell you. I mean, you're like 7th, 8th, on the 9th on the list up there as far as the cost. And this is based on your water consumption, the 37 cubic meters that you're talking. So everybody else has been adjusted to use 37 cubic meters on this table. And if you go down to the bottom of the page, you see Mahone Bay in Victoria County, both in the $250 a quarter range for water. You're at in the $80 range. Okay, so you're in, even with your increase, you still have very, very good rates. Okay, so I would not be afraid if I were you to say to anyone, yes, we do have some of the best rates in the province. You certainly do. At the bottom, I put the median, so the median is half above and half below you is $119.95, so $120, and the average or the mean is $129.50. So you're well below average, you're well below the median. I'm serious, you should have that in your back pocket. If someone says we're paying too much, you actually get pretty good rates for surface water supplies.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. The first 4 of the first 5 water utilities there all have groundwater. Groundwater is inherently cheaper to treat because you just generally have to quality it, where you don't have to have a big expensive treatment plant. And Digby has the luxury of at least a couple of fish plants, I think, who are usually big water users.
Anyway, that's it.
That chart that you just handed out lists the $1.14 as the price instead of the $1.21.
Oh, okay. That number should be $83.20 is what it should be, but it still leaves you, you're gonna lose one position, you're gonna lose to the town of Stellarton, who are talking to us about raising their rates. It should be $84.67, you're right. I had troubles with that table right from the beginning this time around.
That was one of the other things that I noticed, that most of the people that are below us in price are probably due for a rate increase.
Yeah, Stellarton is due, their rate was set in 2008, they're talking to us right now. Certainly Amherst is talking to us right now, we're doing theirs, we're doing their review there. Trenton have called us and said they're going to let us know, but I think they've had some staff changes. And we should tell them no, none of the others, but certainly Richmond County are talking to us. No, it certainly, it's always in motion, and but the fact that you're in the, what I call the the lower quartile, you're in good company. If it's $80 or $85, you're still in what I call great company.
It always amazes me on water rates or sewer rates to be the same. You look at compare them to internet rates, and you look at the infrastructure that the water and sewer utility needs, you look at the infrastructure that the internet needs, compare the two of them, not even close.
No.
So you're saying we should raise our rates?
I think if you don't raise your rates, you're gonna run yourself into a deficit, and then when we're back here, it's gonna be like 35%.
No, I'm talking about the internet rates.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Oh, no, we've had this battle more than once where people tell us they're paying too much, and, you know, you pay more for cable TV and your cell phone than you do for water. I mean, you buy cable, especially cell phones, you buy them by the month. This is for 4, this is 3 months. Yeah, yeah, so, there's a dramatic difference. People will pop, $75 or $100 a month for a cell phone. That's
So
$300.
it's very important that anyone who has any questions, ask for clarification, because you will be asked about why the water rates are going up, especially if you have any of your constituents that are on water rates. So, just as see if I've got this right. Correct. So our expenses are going up because we're reallocating labor that was never charged to utility, but is actual utility labor. So we're now putting in the labor that belongs to the utility. The direct cost for the leak detection, so that's $25,000 and then 10. So there's a $25,000 increase coming up because we're losing. Where did I put this?
Half our water.
About half our water.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're losing through leaks.
And because you're gonna spend some capital money on that, your depreciation is gonna go up too. And that's a good thing, because it means you'll be able to reinvest that little bit more.
Yeah, and then we've also added in like source of supply,
Right.
which was never, ever there before.
Yeah,
It has
and-
to be added in as an expense.
I think there's been a reallocation of costs among departments, but there's also been a realization that perhaps not the water utility was, the municipality was charging all of the appropriate costs to the water utility. And there's been some movement to do that. And the board supports that. The board wants the cost it should be the cost. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be supported by the taxpayers, basically. We should pay for the water as it is.
But all utility users should be paying for all this, rather than some of these costs which are spread out through, say, the engineering department in other ways. And our base rate's 40%, consumption rate is 60%. So therefore, if a customer feels pinched, they can always try to reduce their consumption rate. And our consumption rate has only decreased 1% since 2002. You said something about.
The total, your average consumption per residential customer is virtually not changed.
Since 2002, so
Yeah.
despite everything.
The last number I had.
They've gone up and gone back down again, but right now it's about what it
Average
was.
where you're,
Yeah, about 150 cubic meters a year. Okay.
and what else will people want to ask?
So this increase will add approximately $9.60 quarterly on their bill
Yes, in the first year.
in the first year.
And then it will decrease.
And then it actually, it actually goes, I did all those calculations for me here, so just give me a second here. It goes up 30 cents the second year, and then it goes up $3.34 in the final year.
And those numbers are right.
Yeah, that's the numbers right out of that table on page 36. I just subtracted one off the other.
When you think of it,
Don't let everybody ask me what they are.
part of the reason that in the second and third year, their expenses, you know, we budgeted actually, for, except for cases we know they're different, we've got a 3% increase. But if there's no increase in customer numbers, we haven't put in, or no increase in consumption, that's flat, so rates would have to go up to 3%. You get a little bit of a kick in, help in the second year, because we're gonna pay off that loan with the operating surplus we have. And so your debt payments will drop somewhat. So there's still some.
The leak detection program goes down $15,000 from year 1 to year 2.
And then we're gonna use the monies in the other fund to help as we upgrade our transmission lines.
Exactly.
Or that,
That's
we're gonna
the
use
one.
that 1 million plus that water utility users actually pay. So it's their money, we're not taking money from the general taxpayer,
No.
that's their money, that's
Money that
sitting.
the customers have put in the system.
Yeah, the depreciation number is part of your rate structure, and it's made exactly for that use, you know, because of the cost difference between when that was put in 40 years ago and now, it'll never be enough, but it'll help. It certainly helps. But I
Yes,
just know that's water.
it's water money.
We have $2 or $3 million worth of depreciation every year, and we spend every cent of it. We have Halifax has an old system, it's always in need of repair. And as Gary said, it's like doing the laundry, it'll never be done. If you ever finished it, it'll be time to start again.
You fix all the leaks this year, there'll be some new ones next year, don't worry. You won't be able to work.
Director Vino, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's not a question, it was just something else that I will add. We're also putting in a comprehensive meter replacement program.
Yeah.
So if you look on page 11, if you go down to the maintenance of meters, you'll see that we spend $3,900, $5,200, but then we go up to $26,000, $29,000, and $31,000. Director of Engineering and Public Works and I were having a conversation, and he said that a lot of our meters are very old, and we need to be proactive and start replacing them. I believe we were gonna do 60 a year, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but we wanted to build that in so that, you know, we're trying to be proactive here rather than reactive, and by putting that in place now over the 3 years, we certainly won't get them all done in the 3 years, but it kind of lightens the load. If they all go in an 18-month period, then we're looking at a huge expense. So this way, at least we're preparing, we're being proactive, and we're building it into the new rates.
That's an excellent point, thanks for reminding us of that. Water meters don't speed up as they get older, they slow down. They don't measure all the consumption that they're going through. So that could be, you know, if you replaced all the meters, you're gonna get more accurate consumption, and it could be part of the water loss problem.
Yeah.
They should,
So
but
they
any
come
other
from water,
utility
but
assets,
it's
they only
on
last for
meters.
so long.
Yeah.
And so they should be replaced on a systematic basis.
The old rule is 20 years. That's it, 20 years old meters, take them and either recalibrate and clean, put back, which you can do the larger one, but the smaller ones, the 5/8 inch, it's not worth it. It's just cheaper to buy a new one. Take the brass out of the old one and.
When would any of our meters, what do you do replace, seven?
A few odds and ends, I think, but as a rule, no, so they're very old is what I understand from.
From 20 years.
Yeah, so this is
Yeah.
another part of being proactive, and, you know, by doing it now, we're building it into the new rate. So we'll be prepared, and for us, it's about knowing that we have taken every step we can to prevent some horrible reactive measure in the future. And, I mean, I'm pretty sure that we're not gonna be waiting another 20 years before we revisit this. We'll know in the end of 3 years when we have, really tight expenses and, revenues, that where we are, to go back and revisit if this, you know, if we need adjusting.
Yeah, our rule is generally, you get 4 years out of a rate study. You know, we try to be as accurate as we can for the staff, and 4 years means that you've got the last year, which is the year that we did the budgeting for year 3.
Councilor Fancy, you had a question?
Yes, very good report, I enjoy it, it's nice to look at this and understand it all. One concern is, which is probably not a concern, but are we built in for growth with our transmission lines? say if all of a sudden we got a bunch of apartment buildings in and it seems like this is our aging population, and that you start building this with our transmission lines, are we set up to be able to accommodate for a large growth?
I don't know your system off by heart, but I would suggest is the reservoirs there in the town?
Just by the treatment plant itself.
Okay. I really can't answer it, but I suspect that there's adequate capacity and if it's a large diameter. It's still large enough to fight the fire protection, build enough water to deliver to apartments and things. Because again, back to remember the pipe is sized, if the reservoirs are big there, it's going through the transmission line, the pipe is sized to handle that fire flow, which is 60% of it, so there's more than room in there to put residential customers, more customers.
And the other part of that too is if you are able to reduce your water loss, that means there's more water to sell.
Yeah.
As long as wherever those apartments are built where the utility runs.
Yeah.
Because if they choose
That's
to
right.
like build out there, well then, no, because we don't have any transmission lines.
That's
But as long as they build
Yeah.
where a transmission line runs,
I would suggest that you would just basically, my brain's working here as an engineer now, and I'm just saying, if you can deliver the water to fight the fire, you can deliver the consumption water.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they Norman, just, if everybody refers to page 13 for a second, I just want to clarify, make sure everybody understands exactly what's being proposed here. So the bottom chart on the bottom right-hand side shows depreciation fund balance beginning of the year, $1,059,000. And $802.92 in my glasses, but anyway, it's.
$802.
So it's $1,059,000, and each year there's some interest that accrues, and it stays in that account. And then on the left side, it shows we're gonna do a project next year, or we're doing a project this year, which is the Roy Turner Drive, extending that line. And so that money comes out, and then the contribution during the year, each year we're required as part of the rates, and the rate amounts, you'll see money going into the depreciation. So at the end of the year, of the end of this year, that reserve, that depreciation fund will be down to $913,000. If you go to the next page, the depreciation is gonna go down to $747,000. And if you go to page 15, it's gonna go down to $623,000. And then on the last page, it's gonna go down to the page 2016, it's gonna go down to $500,000. So we're able to keep the rates stable because what we're doing is the people who have contributed to the rates today have built up a depreciation reserve, and as Blaine said, it's for replacing capital assets. And so the proposal is we're going to take about $600,000 out of that to pay for some of those capital upgrades rather than borrow, and pay principal and interest payments, which then affect the rates. Okay, but the offset is we're going to take people's money who have contributed to it, and we're going to spend it in the next couple of years. So we're going to decrease that reserve by about $600,000, which will show in our financial statements. But as the consultants have told us, the board frowns upon us building up reserves too big without a specific purpose for it. And so we're going to, the proposal is that's what we need to do, and that will keep the rates lower, because if we don't, then all that money, all of those capital projects for the next few phases of building in that redundant line on Roy Turner Road, we're gonna have to borrow for it. And if we don't get some of this, cost sharing money as is proposed, then that impacts it as well. So we need to, so that's part of the reason why we're keeping the rates low. Okay, but just so you're aware, we are gonna take those $600,000 we're proposed to, if council agrees, out of that depreciation reserve over the next 4 years, 3 years, 4 years, in order to help pay the capital costs. We don't have to increase the rates by borrowing money and paying interest charges. The other part is on page 9. You'll see at the bottom of column 2, it shows we have an accumulated surplus of $599,155. Okay, or that's what we're projecting. So that's at the end of each year. If we have a surplus in the operating, then that goes into that account. And then if we have a deficit, that's how we pay for it. It doesn't come out of the tax rate. We actually pay for that deficit from that surplus that's there. Okay. And so what we've also suggested is next year, is it next year or this year, the balloon payment?
Next year.
Next year,
Yeah,
next year's
we
balloon
started
payment, which is
22,
showing,
23, yeah.
which is showing on line, the, next to it on line, column 3 at the bottom there, 245,000. So we borrowed for the water utility for 15 years, or we probably borrow for 20 years. But you can only borrow for 15 years at a time.
Right.
So in year 15, which will be the end of this year, we have a balloon payment, or we have an amount outstanding of 245,000. Normally you would go borrow again for another 5 years to pay it, but what we're suggesting is, rather than go borrow and pay principal and interest payments over the next 5 years, is we're gonna take that $599,000, and we're just gonna pay off the 245,000, get it done. Okay, so it's gonna have less surplus, we'll have about, it's like 260,000 or whatever left in surplus, so we'll have a little bit there, so if we need some extra money, we have it there. We'll also have $500,000 in depreciation, so we'll still have some money there. So we're not empty the bank, but we are significantly decreasing our cash by about, over the next few years, about $750,000. But it's the users of the system who have created the cash, and we're simply just giving them their money back now to pay for the improvements and pay for the costs, rather than increase the rates and keep the money in the bank longer. Okay, so I just want everybody to be aware of that, so when the financial statements over the next couple of years, you'll see that we're decreasing that cash by about $750,000 in those couple different funds. Yeah, and that's how we're keeping the rates stable, because otherwise if we did do that, we'd be borrowing for that next year, which is gonna be a new principal payment, new interest, and as well for that depreciation fund for all the projects we're doing on that Roy Turner Drive. We'd be borrowing and paying principal and interest, and that would affect the rates, because that's a new expense every year. So in order to do that, we're simply taking some of the cash we have now and paying our bills up front.
And Roy Turner Drive is the main line that comes from a water treatment plant that comes down and feeds Liverpool, and that's 1890 something. So that's the one that's literally needs to be done, because that feeds everybody, Liverpool and Brooklyn. And that's an expense of $250,000 or so a year. That's working on that. Deputy Mayor Muse, did I see your hand, or was it? Another council hand?
So over 4 years, we're taking the capital reserve down from about $1 million to 500,000. If we continue on that way, that capital reserve will disappear.
I wouldn't advise that.
No.
What I would see in the future, the next rate study is probably look at using some of that, because you're contributing over $100,000 a year to it. You might use some of it, but I would look at stabilizing the rates by borrowing, perhaps not equally each year, but borrowing some each year and try to get the rates, as even, what our objective is, what the board tells us they like, is that we can keep the rates, the change per year equal. They're happier with us. They're happier, their feedback they get is happier, so if we can make it 5% a year or 4% a year, then that's what they want, as opposed to 112 and 2 zeros.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering, if
Yeah,
next
so
time.
I would see that, I would see leveling out. I just think that, it's our thought that based on the hearings that we've done, is that you're carrying way more reserve than a utility this size needed. And our first question was, do you have a big expenditure coming up? So do you have to replace a reservoir, do you have to replace a water treatment plant or something? Are you saving it for a big job? And the answer was no, we're not. So then our suggestion back was, well, you really should spend it, you can stabilize your rates, you get 3 more years out of it, then you'll sooner or later you will have to borrow something, because you just don't generate enough cash to maintain the system.
Yeah, that answers that.
Did you have a further question, Councilor Fancy?
Yeah, this, I don't know if it's relevant or not, but when we bring the water line along, do we bring the sewer along with it to do it at the same time, because we're keeping up the ground?
If I may, Mayor Governor, it depends on where we're doing it at.
Yeah.
So, but 99% of the time, we do water and sewer at the same time.
Yeah.
But the water portion gets allocated to the water utility.
That's right.
The sewer portion gets allocated to the sewer utility.
Yeah.
In the past, there's been some cross-contamination, which
Yeah.
have, made
Poor
the,
choice of words.
which have made the budgets,
Right.
not necessarily accurate, and so that's why we're correcting all that now.
Yeah. I knew it wasn't relevant to what we were doing, but just, if I don't ask it now, I'll forget it.
Cross-pollination. But sometimes some of the sewer costs have floated into the water, and some of the water
Yeah.
floated into the sewer,
Yeah.
and so then it, doesn't necessarily accurately reflect the actual cost of the system.
Any other questions of Blaine and Jerry while we have them here? Chris and Joanne are very adept on this.
Not me.
Joanne.
Ms. Vino and Mr. Grant.
Ms. Vino and Mr. Grant, I wonder if we should do a cheat sheet of notes.
We will, we'll eventually issue a press release of some sorts of information to the public about what the impacts are going to be. The fact that the
Yeah.
public will have the opportunity when there is a rate hearing set, probably later this fall, early winter, that the public will have the opportunity to provide written submissions or appear before the committee and make comments if they wish to.
The board will make you publish, the board will request that you publish it in the newspaper, they'll make up the ad, they'll tell you where they want it published.
Yeah, and the other thing is that, our suggestion in today's world is we always say make a paper copy available at the front desk and put it on their webpage. As soon as the board has it, and they declare the hearing date, you say, put it out there, get it out and let people look at it. The board has rules and regulations which they publish. If you want to, you can write them, explain if you have a difficulty, so one of your constituents wants to write them. That's one way. The other way is you can ask to appear. You have to ask at least 24 hours, I believe, or 36 hours before the hearing. So people don't walk in and have a free-for-all. But you can ask to appear. No one's ever turned down. Okay, so you can ask to appear and ask questions or to make a statement. If you want to ask questions, you have to register as what's called an intervener. But again, it's easy to do. You just simply write them and say, I'd like to register as an intervener. And at that point in time, you can come as a member of the public and ask questions at the hearing. And you'll get all the information. You have the right to ask questions to the utility before the hearing, written questions. You can send them written questions. You can say, hey, I've got a problem with this. I think something wrong with it. And occasionally we get that, but most times people really will send in emails. Sometimes we get letters, and occasionally someone will show up and say, I must be, but to be honest with you, it's generally when we're raising rates like 35% that people really start showing up. And it's not pleasant for us, it's not pleasant for them, and we know that. It's not pleasant for the board either. No one wants to do that. You don't want to let your rates go, that you're in deficit year after year. And as Blaine says, the first thing you have to do is get out of the hole, and that's usually 20 or 30%. So you've clipped this one in time. You've got a very small deficit this year. It's showing up in the states there at the 12% and the $9.
So probably had all of the correct expenditures been listed where they should have been, there would have been a slight deficit probably last year.
Yeah, it's hindsight, who knows?
Who knows, but we know this year.
We may have been here a couple of years earlier.
Let's move to 10.1. Where there is a recommendation.
Thank you.
So, if somebody would make the recommendation. 10.1. Councilor Romero.
I move that the Region of Kings Municipality apply to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board for changes in its rates for water and water service, fire protection to the Region of Kings Municipality, and changes to its rules and regulations for customers served by the Region of Kings Municipality Water Utility as set out in the water rate study prepared by GARs and Consulting Limited in association with Blaine as written. Consulting Limited dated July 27th, 2021.
And that is seconded by Councilor Gibb. Are there any further comments or questions? Councilor Charlton?
I think that was a really well thought of presentation. It was explained really clearly, so I just wanna thank those two gentlemen who made it crystal clear.
Yes, and I think we all echo the fact that, we understand this. Hearing no other questions, I'll ask for the question. All those in favor? Contrary? Passed.
Madam Mayor, you'll excuse yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Safe travels back. 15 minutes will not allow enough time to do the audit report. I do not believe.
Couldn't go longer.
You wanna run through and then, do you wanna get the audit report finished up, and then that will leave us with the planning reports and in-camera items for later today? Yes? Right. 11.2. Yeah, there is a motion, and perhaps Councilor Brown, as chairman of the Internal Audit Review Committee, would like to make that motion.
I'd like to recommend that the Council of the Region of Queens Municipality adopt the audited financial statements for the fiscal year ended March 31st, 2021.
Seconded by Councilor Hawks. Consolidated statements are quite different from anyone who runs a business who's accustomed to seeing off an expenditure and an operational sheet. However, this is what is, this is the law. This is how municipalities must present their audited financial statements. And these statements were presented at the last internal review committee, and, now they're being presented to us.
So I will, just to echo what Mayor Norman said, just some Cole's notes on consolidation versus non-consolidation. So if you have, 4 pockets in your coat, each of those separate pockets would be reported on separately in the non-consolidated statements. But what the consolidated statements do is they add everything in all 4 pockets together. So that is, to what Mayor Norman said, that is required by public sector accounting standards, but it's not really a useful tool for all of you because everything is in one blob. So what we do is we break everything out in detail in the non-consolidated statements. If the audit is done on the consolidated statements alone. However, all of the information from the consolidated statements flow directly from the non-consolidated statements. So even though the non-consolidated statements say unaudited and there's an advisory to reader right in that set of statements, all of the information from the consolidated came from here. So you can rest assured that while it wasn't perhaps audited directly, all of the information came from here to get to the consolidated statements, okay? Would you like me, I have notes on the statements, I'll just go through them, or have you guys all read them over? You can ask me questions, like what is it that will be useful to you?
The notes, because I found it was most helpful for the audit committee.
Okay, fair enough.
that Gloria went through them and
Okay.
actually made comments, yeah.
Yeah, so in the audit and the internal control committee, Gloria Banks came, and she is our principal auditor from Grant Thornton. So she went over all of the ins and outs of the consolidated statements, and really, I just briefly touched on the non-consolidated ones for everyone on the audit and internal control committee, and there were a couple of things that needed tweaking. So I got that done before you have the draft in front of you. That is the result of that meeting. So I'm going to start by looking at the consolidated statements and looking over some of the high notes in it. So if you will turn please to page A4. This is the consolidated statement of financial position. This is a snapshot statement. So this says, as of March 31st, 2021, this is everything we had in our pockets, okay? So it gives us the cash, and when I looked at these, when I was interviewing for this job, I looked at the statements from last year, and I was like, wow, $20 million, those people be rich. That's a lot of cash. But $16 million of that is committed through reserves, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this goes through your accounts, your receivables, that's people that owe you money, the liabilities, people that we owe money to. The big thing on this page, if you look under liabilities, deferred revenue, we typically don't have a lot of deferred revenue, but this year we have the state restart funds. That's why we have $548,000 of deferred revenue. A lot of, I think $449 of that is safe restart funds. The thing that I want to draw your attention to is the solid waste post-closure liability, that $3.2 million. I just want you to kind of keep that number in the back of your head, because we're gonna talk about that a little bit later, okay? That is a liability on our balance sheet, because it's what we think we're going to need to close the landfill and keep it in the way in which the government says for another 30 years after it's closed. We have to monitor it and do all the test wells and things like that. So, inventory of supplies, that's pretty straightforward. That is the water pipes and fittings and things like that. Prepaid expenses is higher than last year, mainly because we have a big Blue Cross premium that they prepaid, so that was in there. That's our medical plan, and the SAP support that was prepaid. So that's really all the items of interest on A4. I'm not gonna spend as much time on the consolidation as I will on the non-consolidation. So if you have any questions, just say if I get carried away. So in terms of the revenue and expenses, again, keep in mind, this is all of our pockets added together. So in consolidation, when you move money from one pocket to the other, that's called fiscal transfers in our budget. When we bring money in from the reserves and put it out to the reserves, those are all canceled out, because consolidation is all one jacket. You move money from my this pocket to this pocket, it's still in my jacket. So the transfers are all, they all cancel each other out. So all we're looking at here is the revenue at the top, very straightforward. We have taxation, and I'll talk a little bit about why that went up later. Sales of service, same thing. The water rates is in there. There's the hydrant that Blaine and Jerry talked about, the $197,235. Government transfers went up because we got safe restart money. Services provided to other governments. There was, I think that was a reallocation for me from last year. We collect a certain number of dollars per tonnage when we take garbage in from other municipalities. And I believe last year it was included in other revenue from own sources, when it really should have been the revenue from other local governments. So I reallocated it this year. Government transfer capital contribution. That is your gas tax. People, I know that's been a lot of discussion. It has a line all by itself. $671,000, $671,000, $655. Does that right? Did I? 1.374 million is what we got last year, which was, obviously almost double. We sold the bus garage this year, was fully depreciated, so that's where the $116,000 came from. Quickly going through the expenses on a consolidated basis, general government services went up
We had, $25,000 extra in admin cleaning, we had $60,000 extra in legal. There was, the noise dispute, and there was, some legal surrounding, I think, the Trestle Trail land that had significant, legal bills associated with it. There was $55,000 that was given to Queens County Transit, and an additional $50,000 that we included in expenses for uncollectible taxes this year. Remember, we talked about the valuation allowance and how we had to fix that and make sure it was, correct. The environmental health services expenses, that is landfill, post-closure expense. Remember I said, that's a difference of $800,000 between last year and this year. We're gonna talk about that later. That's a biggie. Don't forget, there'll be tests. Environmental development services, on that line, the broadband investment that we pulled in from gas tax is there, $437,000. Don't worry, we're gonna talk about this more in the non-consolidation. Cultural and recreation services, that's where our contribution for the Trestle Trail Bridge was of $487,000, okay? So if you look at that, the difference between the surplus we had last year, well, $2 million, and the surplus we have this year of $598, which is, $600,000. You have to think about it. Our gas tax was reduced by half, so that cut that revenue down, and we incurred expenses of the broadband, the Trestle Trail Bridge, and we actually had an increase in expense for our landfill of $800,000. Okay? None of those things were budgeted, because they're not part of our budget. So the second page is a statement of cash flows, and all of these statements are required, so that people can easily see where our money went, where we used it. So if you see for example, look under operating activities, increase in solid waste closure and post-closure costs, $875,000. That's added back because that's a non-cash expense. We don't have to pay anybody that yet. We pay in 20 years in the future when we close the landfill. So that's why it's added back on our cash flow. The deferred revenue, there's the safe startup money that we have for $449. That's how much cash we kept out of that. There was some changes in our payables and accruals. We invested $1.16 million in tangible capital assets. And I have a note, a specific note in the non-consolidated statements that'll tell you where and how much each were. We had $323 invested in the water assets, and then of course there's our gain on the bus garage. We had $325,000 worth of new debt. That was debt from last year, was budget approved from last year for, I believe, the Jubilee. Is it Jubilee? New debt of $325,000 was incurred as approved by council February 11, 2020 for Brooklyn sewer and water upgrades. So that means it was last year the work was done, but we actually got the money in this fiscal year. Okay, so we're going to statement of changes in net financial assets, A7. This tells you what you have to watch this because this is where we look at net change in financial assets, $1 million versus the 2.3. We have to make sure that always stays positive and grows because it's a reflection of how much we're investing in our infrastructure and capital assets. We get to the notes next. There's going to be, there's a lot of these notes that are duplicates, so I only have this one, the budget one, A20, noted, because it's the difference between, remember when we do our budgets every year? The budget, we budget the operating. We don't budget we don't budget anything going in and out of the reserve. We don't budget amortization, which is over $1 million a year. So because of the rules in public sector accounting, I have to take our budget and I have to add the expenses for amortization. I have to add the water in because remember our water budget is separate from our operating budget. And then I have to cancel out, you'll see where it says transfer from own funds under revenue, the last thing in both sections, 481,560 minus 41,560. So the fiscal plan for the financial statements is 0. So according to this, we budgeted a $406,000 deficit. So again, it just goes to show that it's not really, this document, while it's great for public sector accounting standards, isn't a good tool for us, because we would have never budgeted a $400,000 deficit, right? But when you take that $1 million worth of amortization off, boy, that's a lot of money right there. Okey dokey? Yep. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go now, does anyone have any questions about the consolidation? I know I kind of flipped through it because really, this is the nuts and bolts right here, our non-consolidated statements. Anybody have any questions on the difference? Anybody need to go get coffee? You're all good? Okay. So now I'm on the non-consolidated financial statements, and you'll notice that the first page is the advisory to readers that say these are not audited, okay? Then we have our index page. The first thing I want to show you on B1 is the last line under expenditures. Transfer current year surplus. Our surplus was $805,665. That was our surplus. And last year, what was happening was, because last year the surplus was 441. You'll see it down the bottom line. So last year and every year before that, the surplus was being allowed to accumulate in the accumulated surplus in the operating company. That's not allowed according to public sector accounting standards. So what I did was I had to pull all of that money out of operating and put it into the special operating reserve. And so this year, that's why there's the transfer of current year surplus for 2020 is 0 because it wasn't done. That $441,000 went into the accumulated surplus of operating, and you'll see me later move that out into the special operating reserve. Now the difference between the 441 and the 805 was in previous year, what was being done was certain expenses and revenues were being pulled from the landfill accounts to make a number called landfill profits. And that number was about $450,000 a year. And it was pulled, it was expensed in operating, and it was moved to the second generation landfill reserve. Now, either way, if it stays here in the $805,000 or it gets transferred to the special reserve, it's still in reserve. The issue is, if it's in the second generation landfill reserve, that's where it has to be used. Technically, that 805, including that 4, goes to the special operating reserve, which means it can be used for what council designates it to be used for. Is that correct, Chris? Yes. So, I'm not sure why this was being done, but CAO McNeil and I discussed it, and we just felt that it was just, we're not doing it anymore. And that's why our revenue is so much higher than last year's surplus. Even with COVID, it's $805,000. And you may get asked by your constituents, well, you guys, you have a surplus of $805,000. Well, half of it is because of this number that we're no longer moving, okay? Does anyone have any questions on that? I'm trying to explain that.
So half of it is profit from the landfill.
Half of it is, I wouldn't even.
Or not profit.
I don't think, it wasn't even, the accounts were pulled such that it showed a profit, but it wasn't, because it was like cherry picking numbers and then creating this number and then moving this number to the second generation landfill reserve. So it didn't really make any sense to me, and it didn't make any sense to CAO McNeil either. So we just said, this is just ridiculous, because at the end of the day, it all goes into our savings. Remember when I first started, I said we have little savings jars? Well, it all goes into the savings jar, but this one would go into the second generation landfill reserve, which is specifically designed, put there to pay for the new cell to be built. But now it goes into the general savings account that isn't designated.
right? So it goes to savings either way, it's just, it was designated before and now it's in the general.
So are there any are there any funds that automatically go to that second generation landfill? Or
Yes,
will it be?
Absolutely, $536,000 a year, it's part of our operating budget.
From, alright, so
Yeah.
so actually, $1 million is getting shelved.
Correct. It was a lot.
And then that limits us for, we can't
For
use
money
money
to
to
use
operate.
for other projects.
Well, and that's the thing, so I just wanted to explain that, I hope I didn't help you. Now let's go to B2. Is everyone still awake?
I see why you love this.
We just gotta be careful that we don't, we're not suggesting we've got all this new money, because we don't.
No.
This is just how we're accounting for it on the financial statements, and what we're suggesting is, we need to do a better job at accounting properly for it, as to where it should go, and not just put it into in a reserve somewhere that's hidden, it's not, nothing's hidden, but by putting it in, all this extra money into landfill, essentially handcuffs council's hands to be able to spend on anything else. But going forward, we need to budget differently, so that money is available if we, council decides to make it available for other initiatives or other projects or other departments, or whatever it might need to be.
So on page B2, I wanted to just point out, if you look under taxes receivable, we have the valuation allowance for uncollectible taxes, and we all talked about that at the last council meeting, remember when I came with my little valuation allowance sheet? And that is because we are expected and obligated to say, how much of the taxes we feel aren't collectible. So we'll be having I'll be bringing a policy forward to the audit and internal control committee later in the year about that. We have a 13% improvement in tax collection, thanks to the manager of finance and her hard work over last year, so that is great. We also know that there were a lot more people that, because of the CERB, had money that were available to pay their taxes. Something that we did hear in the audit and internal control committee was that a lot of those people now are in financial trouble. So we'll see what happens. This year, it was good. We collected a lot of our taxes, as we talked about in the quarterly report, but we'll see how it flushes out at the end of the year. What next? Okay, so let's go right down to the bottom where it says net financing. You see it says prior period adjustment, $36,412. That was an entry that I had to correct that was made last year after the audit was finished. So I had to go back and reverse that entry. And then here's me, transfer accumulated prior year surplus to special operating reserve. So that 2.14 million surplus is me taking it from the operating company as an accumulated surplus and moving it to the special operating reserve. That is what we are supposed to be doing for public sector accounting, okay? And I have to move the cash literally in the bank over from one bank account to the other. And you'll see this, it creates a big due to from, but after this was all done, we actually physically moved the cash. So it is actually over there. Okay, does everyone have, have I lost, everyone's good? Good so far? Good. Christine, you with me? All right.
So just to clarify, so at the bottom of the page, the accumulated surplus last year was 2.1 million out of zero. We haven't lost 2.1 million,
No.
it's just transferred to the proper reserves that were required to by auditing standards.
Yeah. Just moving it to where it should live, where it's supposed to live. So page B3, this is our statement of financial position of our capital fund. So the first statement of financial position was our operating fund. So that was our one of our pockets. This is the capital fund. Now in this pocket, this is where all of our things that we own live. All of our sidewalks, our streets, our sewers, all of that, the trucks, all of the assets called tangible capital assets that we own, it lives in this pocket or fund. Now, if you look under liabilities, you'll see the landfill liability estimate of what it will cost to close and monitor the landfill. That's the $3.29 million that we talked about from the consolidation. Again, that's important. And because you look at the difference between last year, 2.4, and this year, 3.2. Due to froms are just one fund owing the other fund money. Long-term debt, that's how much money we owe. Tangible capital assets and costs, there's a note that we'll talk about later that'll detail out where our $81 million is. And then we have our accumulated surplus in the capital account of $44 million. So the non-consolidated capital fund statement of financial activities and changes in fund balance, that just tells you what moved from one pocket to the other into or out of the capital fund. So you'll see here the $875,000 for that, they call, accounting word is accretion landfill liability. That's there. And then you'll see the amortization, the 1.8 million, that's there. Transfer from equipment reserve, that is $347,000 that came to pay for two of our, equipment for public works, a truck and a cat thing for the landfill. That was budget approved from, the special operating and the equipment reserve, and then this one, the sewer and gas tax reserve, 819 paid for Jubilee and Brooklyn. So, because the assets live here, the money has to come in here to pay for the assets. Because you'll see the capital fund doesn't have a lot of cash. They don't have a lot of cash, so when we have something live here, it has to be paid for, so the money has to come in from one of the other funds to pay for it. You with me? So this is basically a breakdown of how much our assets are and what kind of section they're in. There's a note in the back of the financial statements that include the water. It's the same note. And this is broken out, the way that PSAS, Public Sector Accounting Standards, likes to see it. I have a lot more detail in my sheets because I have to break it out by each individual asset, literally. Like each sidewalk, when it was built, what year, how many years it has left. So it's a lot more detailed. So if you ever want to know anything about how old something is, come see me and I'll do my best to find out for you. Okay, now we're to the good stuff. B5. Taxes. So our assessment values increased for residential. We got, I think, about $198,000 more. Commercial property, we had reallocated Port Mersey because it was in grants in lieu, was it not, last year? So we reallocated that to commercial property, so that's corrected. We looked at our taxable assessments for resource and to try and look at why it went down, and there was a decrease in resource tax base in North Queens. So we didn't have time to really dig down and find out what that was, but there was a decrease in the resource up there. What else do I have on this page? Nothing of interest. The deed transfer taxes here, see? 440 last year, 547, 690 this year, about halfway down the page. And then of course we have things taken off of our taxes. We have to pay for correctional services. That's the jail. Regional Housing Authority, that's 142 versus the budget of 105, so that was about a 30% increase in what we expected to pay. And then appropriation to the Central Regional Center for Education, so that's what we have to pay for the school board, that's mandated by the province, and it's based on our assessments. So if our assessed value goes up, it's, last year was, I think this year is 3.5 cents. So if our assessment value, our base goes up, so does the amount that we have to pay the school boards. Does anyone have any questions on B5? No? Services provided to other governments, that's landfill services that we provide other governments. Sales of services, protective services, that's pretty self-explanatory. Environmental health services, that's a landfill to the public. So that did go up last year. As we all heard the stories about people doing renovations and things like that. Well, that's what was going on in our landfill. We went from $817,000 to $883,000, so that was a good thing. Revenue from own sources, section 5. The big thing was there was no call center revenue last year, and that's under rentals. And then, of course, we had our return on investments went down to Swanee because interest rates went down we're gonna look and see how we can fix that this year. Our interest and penalty revenue went down. The council approved a 1-month interest forgiveness last year because of COVID, if you all remember. So none of you, I don't think, well, Jack, you would, Councilor Pansy would have been around. So that was, it decreased the amount of interest that we were able to collect. Queen's Place, of course, that's COVID, you know, it was closed for a number of months of the year. Unconditional transfers from other governments, no big surprises there. And conditional transfers from the federal government, we got the extra safe restart fund, which is a big bump from us. And we also got some more, diversion tax credits that were unbudgeted, so that accounted for the increase there. Is there any questions on B6? Nope, okay. Okay, B7, so this is the last, revenue part.
So I have one question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So why pass council budget, I'm trying to get my line straight here, 50,000 DMA funding, and it's actual is 6,000.
For departmental affairs.
Oh, right.
I think that was the funding we applied to,
Was that the Wayfair? No.
No, I think that was, we applied for 50,000 or something like that to be a REN,
Oh.
cause that was way back, cause this is last year's financial
Right.
statement. It was either the REN or it was, facade program and some other DMA program, and we were turned down, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was no fault of ours, it was just expected.
So we would have budgeted revenue, but we also would have budgeted expenses to the same amount, but if we didn't get the 50,000, there wouldn't be the expenses of 50,000 on the other side.
Well, while we're on the topic of budget, you guys all remember the little house that we're all, you know, all the municipal units have that little house, and everyone must have a full greenhouse, and there's little houses within the house.
Mhm.
One of those houses is budget accuracy. So, what we've seen, the manager of finance and myself, is that if expenses came in under budget, there would be expenses added to the financial statements with the offset being added to reserve, because that way their budget would be correct. So what you're going to see in the next couple of years, as a manager of finance and I work our way through, is we're probably not going to get a greenhouse for budgeting. Because we're gonna be doing it, we're gonna go with the real life, you know, because that's the way it should be done, so be prepared, okay? And further to that, let's look at prior year adjustments. $405,862. That is, a number of things, the biggest of which was $292,400. Keep in mind, when I say dollars, that doesn't mean cash dollars, that just means a value. That was booked as a due to, as in we owe local governments $292,400. We don't. That was $30,000 that was put into this account every year called sediment removal, or PC septage. So this one was PC septage. So what and all of these I discussed with CAO McNeil. So what we needed to move it over, and now it has its own reserve. So it's no longer in accounts payable and operations, which it never should have been. It has its own reserve. So now, if the Director of Engineering and Public Works comes to council at budget time and says, you know, we have to spend some money on sediment removal, we have a reserve set up for this. And we can use that rather than having it affect the tax rate. The other thing was there was transition team funding from 2013 of $52,000 that was still sitting in deferred revenue. So we brought that into revenue, and then all the rest of this money would have gone to the accumulated surplus and special operating reserves. $18,500 that was an accrual set up in 2013 for Auditor General. And CAO McNeil explained to me that in 2013, the government decided that there was gonna be an Auditor General that was gonna go around and audit municipal units because of that spending scandal, do you remember? And then they decided not to do it. So there was an amount that was reported in 2013, but then it just sat there. So we made that go to this accumulated surplus. $8,230 was, For the courthouse, there was an accrual that we owed the province for the courthouse from 2016, we did not owe, so that went away. $5,600 was a 2003 accrual that had been set up, to an ex-employee's estate that never came to fruition. And then, of course, a $36,000 prior period adjustment. So that's where the $405,862 comes from.
It was just money sitting in an account.
It wasn't money, it was pay, there were accruals, like we owe this, we owe that, we owe this, like, we didn't owe this, or this. So at some point, when those payables were set up, it was expensed on the operating statement. So I took the owing money and we move it to the surplus. So, because someone paid for it at some point, but it just we never owed it. Or at the time, I think they thought they would owe it, but eventually we didn't owe it. So that then goes to the accumulated surplus in the special operating reserve. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about that? So it's all cleaned up now. So now we know all of the accounts are nice and tidy. Manager of Finance and I are very happy that we're very content, and we sleep much better at night. Now let's get down to the expenses. B8, General Government Services. The big things that I have noted here, the tax billings, and I talked about this a little bit on our quarterly statement. We had $17,200 last year, and this year was $8,400, so there's a savings there. And you will notice, will you not, that the $8,400 is exactly the same number as the budget?
Too much of a
Because, yes, and we also noted, further to the water conversation of earlier, that none of the expenses associated with billing water was ever allocated to the water utility. None of the mailing, none of the envelopes, none of the printing, none of that. So we'll be fixing that up too. Under common services, you see we went from $76,000 to $99,000. That was cleaning and maintenance for this building. And when I say cleaning, if I say anything about cleaning, sanitary supplies, PPE, we would have recouped all of that money from the Safe Startup Fund. So it has to be recorded as a revenue on one side, as money coming in from Safe Startup, and expense over here, okay? Other, legal for planning. We talked about that in the, I think when I talked about the consolidated, there was some
That's all legal expenses, 110,000, but there were a couple.
There were a couple different ones in there.
But it's not all legal.
The difference between the budget, what I saw was mostly legal. Yeah. Under conventions and elections, we know our election costs us more money again because of COVID, but we got that money back through the Safe Startup Fund. And then under other general government services, other, we budgeted 48, or last year was 48, but we spent 107. That's because we budgeted to give Queens County Transit 26,000 plus 25,000, and then they got another 25,000 from the Safe Restart money, because some of it was mandated and had to go to transit. Okay? And then our uncollectible taxes, which we talked about again when we did our valuation allowance. Everybody good on page B8? We're good? Okay. E9. Protective services. The only thing I really have to note, the firefighting force was the actual 857 versus this year 825. The only thing that, the manager of finance and I had a poke around was that in 2020, there were bunker suits and breathing apparatus that were expensed there, which I'm not sure because I wasn't here, which they should have been or should have not been, but we're a lot better on organizing all of our fire department costs and everything this year, so I'll feel a lot better with that. I don't really have anything from transportation services. There was a paving invoice from TIR that came in late, that was $18,000, so we had to add that to this year's expense. You see, our actual was, $726 last year, we did $744, that includes an extra $18,000, but we're still under budget, so I'm not sure, because both of the, capital projects went ahead that were in the budget. But again, just because there's an expense there, that means I brought $18,000 over to revenue from the special operating reserve to pay for that. So it was like, it's an in and an out. Anybody have any questions on B9? We're almost to the end, then we get to the notes. Okay, B10, environmental health services. This is all of our solid waste. Sewage treatment and disposal. 2020 was $421,000 versus this year was $246,000. Prior year, we had $126,000 expense in town sewer because I believe there was a smell. Yeah, that was the difference. Garbage, waste collection and disposal administration. There were some corrections to wage allocations this year. That's why there's a difference between last year and this year. But we still came in under budget, so that was great. Okay, let's go to B11. 14, environmental development services under admin. Elisa's salary was there. That was the difference between last year and this year. It's the thing that stuck out to me the most. Recreation and cultural facilities, swimming pool, obviously, and we didn't have the expenses because the pools were closed, so we really just ticked things over to make sure that they would be okay this year. And then at the bottom of that page, under fiscal services, this is our $924,000 expense from gas tax on the trestle trail and the broadband. That's the last line. So that's where we spent our gas tax money this year. Well, some of it. We also used it to pay for Jubilee. And I'm going to ask you, I have to lick my fingers, I know that's really bad. Right now, to skip to page B35. This is the last page of the consolidated, B35. This is a note that I added this year because in the council meetings I attended, I noticed there was lots of questions about, how we use paper gas tax and things like that. So I added this note, which is capital project funding, which lists the capital projects that we had this year, and the total of them, and then you see a reserve. So for example, you see the public works truck, $52,000 came from the equipment reserve. The cat loader landfill, $294,000 came from the equipment reserve. And there's that $347,000 figure we saw earlier, remember? Transferred into the capital fund. Then under operating, we have Jubilee. That's our gas tax, because gas tax has its own reserve under special operating reserve, and we'll see that later in another note. Brooklyn, that was financed out of the sewer reserve. And you remember, I came to council last meeting and asked for a temporary borrowing resolution because we missed the debenture. Because when we budgeted it, we were supposed to borrow, and I missed it. So that's the project that I came to you about the temporary borrowing for the fall, which we will repay the sewer reserve. And then the Trestle Trail Bridge, $487 gas tax, and Broadband Canada, $435 gas tax. So then I added a note. So J.W. Murphy Foundation also contributed to the funding of the Trestle Trail project, $380,000 in this fiscal year. Total contribution to this project was $1,220,500. That's $1 million. So that was a big project. So Region of Queens Municipality, we contributed $570,500 from the gas tax. So that was this year that we're just looking at plus last year. And so J.W. Murphy Foundation contributed the remainder of $650. So is that note useful to you when you're looking at, we'll revisit it when we're doing the budgeting process? And then you'll know at a glance, it will be on the website, and you'll have a copy. But I just wanted wanted to have something that was very clean and crisp, it's it's literally all our capital stuff at a glance, what we did and how we paid for it. So we good there? Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. I'm gonna pop that one back in, and I'm gonna go back to page B12. Hillsboro Acres, they got more revenue this year because, the Department of Health and Wellness gave more money to cover wages and PPE, so that's why their revenue was up. But again, that $83,000, that goes to the Hillsboro Reserve, and we'll look at the balance for that on a note that comes later. And now we're to a tasty little water utility that we were just spent the last hour talking about. So, let's talk for a minute about the allocation of labor. It's a big cost for water utility. And so, the Director of Engineering and Public Works and I were talking about this, and we were talking to Paulette, who does our payroll here. There's a spreadsheet that Paulette has used for the last 20 years, yes, that's 2 decades, to allocate wages for the works and the water utility people. That has never been changed. 2 decades, never been changed. So the Director of Public Works and Engineering and myself will be sitting down in the fall, and we will be reworking that so that every pay period, either himself or his assistant will sit down and they will put in the percentage of hours that are spent by each person in each category, and it will generate an entry and allocate that labor based on reality, not on the reality 20 years ago. So I don't really have a lot of faith in the allocation of these expenses, because we've seen, and the manager of finance will concur because she's shown me a lot of things, the revenue is pretty straightforward, but the allocation of expenses between the operating expenditures, I think we're gonna need at least a few years to make sure that they're really tight. I've redesigned this, this statement for the Director of Public Works and Engineering. It has a lot more detail. We won't be providing that to council unless you wanna see it, you of course can. But it will give us a better tool to go forward and look at where we are and are not spending money. Does anyone have any questions about the water utility? I know it's a lot. No? Okay, super. So there's our water utility. And this is our water utility balance sheet. So remember we were talking in the rate meeting about our surplus? There it is, see at the bottom, $599, $157, and there's the cash to cover that surplus at the top, $625. So you can't have really a surplus, you have to have cash to cover it. So that's why we have the $625. I mean, yes, there's some receivables there, some payables there, and that $206,000 in payables, that's not a real payable. That's $180,000 of that is, again, entries that were being made to this account called sediment removal. And we are going to ask the UARB for permission to move that $180,000 to its own reserve, because we can't do that just on a whim, because it's water and everything has to go through the UARB. So we'll put that as part of, we'll ask verbally. Blaine and Jerry said we can ask verbally when we have our hearing, and they'll say yes, and then we can do it. So we don't owe $206,000 to people. We owe $26,000 to people. Okay, anybody have any questions on the water utility? Now, in our funds, the water capital lives in the reserve, a special operating reserve. So water capital means all of the pipes and infrastructure for water doesn't live in the capital fund, it lives in the special operating reserve, and it's called water capital fund, and that's what this is. That, see $1.059 million, that is the depreciation fund that Blaine and Jerry were speaking of earlier. So we have a considerable surplus here. so their recommendation was that we actually start using it and investing in it to, you know, bring our infrastructure up to date. Does anyone have any questions about, that, B15? Good. B16 is a list of all of our, assets that live in that capital fund. All of our goodies. And then at the bottom, you'll see this is the ins and outs of this water capital fund. So it got, so $206,000 was infrastructure that was built and paid for by another fund that now lives in this fund, that's what that is. Interest was obviously money in the bank, and then term debt retired means we paid it, that's payments. They use the word retired and they use the word redeemed, it just means payments. Okay? Alrighty then. Now, B17, so, this is the last pocket, so we talked about the operating pocket, we talked about the capital pocket, we just did the water pocket. Now this is a special operating reserve pocket, and this is a special pocket because it's divided into three, actually four if you count the capital, the water capital. But this is three. So we have a capital reserve, where we put money for buying capital things, and a special operating reserve, and equipment reserve, where we put money away for things like landfill equipment and things like that. So those are the cash balances at the top. And those due to froms are, again, me saying one fund owes the other. Look at that. General operations owes special operating almost $3.5 million. Why do you think that is? Because I hadn't moved the cash yet for that surplus. That's why it has such a big owing. It doesn't now because we actually physically moved the cash. If you go down to the, so this is the balance sheet at the top, and then at the end, at the bottom half of the sheet, this is the ins and the outs all year. So again, look at here. So here's our conditional gas tax, $671,000, that went in, so we're good there, love the gas tax. PC is post-closure, now progressive conservative, just so you know. Contribution from local governments, that's the amount that they pay per ton when they take garbage into our landfill. Donations, $20,000, that's Recreation for Life. And then transfer from operating fund, 4.4, again, thus the revenue. 2 point something of that was our surplus that we moved, right? Financing and other, so we transferred it under operating, we transferred $994,926 to our operating fund, $819,0482 our capital fund, and then $206,061 to our water fund. So you saw that 206 on the previous sheet. You see that, you'll see those two numbers will add to the number on your capital note, because that's how we paid for our capital, okay? Does anyone have any questions about this B17? And if you do, and you wanna take some time and you wanna go and think about it, come back and see me, because what I did was I color coded all of these cells, so I know exactly what goes in and breaks them down. So I can go back and show you, Kevin?
I thought the gas tax was doubled in this year.
Nope, just the one.
It is, that's the current year we're in, this
That's
is
the-
last year's financial statement.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Next year's statement, you'll see that 1.3 or whatever again.
Okay. So now we're gonna get to the notes. Is everybody with me? What time is it? I'm not gonna go through all the accounting policy notes because I'm sure you guys have had a chance to read them. And if you don't, if you wanna read them yourself, go ahead. I know it's been a long morning and people are probably hungry, so I'm gonna skip right to B21, if that's okay. B21 is the receivables note that is very important because it tells you how good we are at collecting our monies from other people. So we've been very good in the past. I talked about that earlier. Our receivables for taxes have gone down 13%, and overall our receivables have gone down 10%. Now that's because A, we have a really good collections policy now, and B, because people have been better about paying their bills. So we have, So the receivables, like government's receivables, they're from like the other local governments for our solid waste, things like that. Water rates and sewer rates is pretty self-explanatory. 288,982, that's the pension asset that we have still on the books. Those of you who are new on council may or may not be aware that at the end of last year, the pension, that was here for the employees here went from something that was internally managed to something that was now part of the province's superannuation plan. So that 288,982 is expected to be very close to the amount that was surplus when the assets were moved, but we don't know what exactly that number will be until the provincial actuary has a look and evaluates the fund. And at that point, that asset will be distributed to the employees as a pension contribution holiday.
Would we do that based upon the past employees that paid into that?
I don't know how that will be done, Darlene, honestly.
Because really, it's their money.
Yeah, well, like me,
Like,
I
it's
wouldn't,
not-
I shouldn't be, no. So, I'm not sure is the answer, but I think that CAO McNeil and I will have to look into it.
The answer is it's not, it's whoever's employed on the day that it happens.
Oh,
They're gonna get a hold of it.
okay, there you go, there's your answer.
Because the pension asset has accumulated over 50 years, 60
Yeah.
years. And so how much somebody that was here 50 years ago is due of that 200, when you cut it in half of that 144,000 is impossible. So the pension standards are that the pension legislation, once it's wound up, then it gets divvied up. So the employer, so the municipality will get half of it, because we contribute half towards the pension plan, so we will receive a lump sum or a contribution over a period of time for half of whatever the remainder is, and then the employees get what's called a contribution holiday, so they get so much per paycheck for the next, could be one pay, could be two, could be three or four, depending on the amount, until that surplus is down to zero.
So that would go toward what they pay for pension?
Yeah, so somebody pays $100 towards a pension on their paycheck today, we would still pay that 100 to the province on their behalf, but they wouldn't pay it to us.
So we take it out of this,
That comes out of this until it's empty.
and we just keep doing that until it's.
Empty.
So it won't be a long time, because it was 288, so if it's 144
Free pays,
between all of our employees, it'll be
3 or 4 pays.
3 or 4 pays, that's what it'll be.
Okay, B22, loans receivable. This is where our loans live from our fire department. You'll notice that the top 3 did not make annual installments in 2020. That was council forgave those loans. B23 is a detailed listing of all our long-term debt with interest rates. So if you're ever interested on how much we owe, broken down, here it is, and you'll see under issued, you'll see the $325,000 and what it was for. So we had, some of it was the water utility, and some of it was, some of it was water utility, some of it was the roads and streets, and then some of it was the sewer.
That's how question.
Yeah.
Why did past council, Mill Village didn't get a break? Right, they still need a payment.
Still asked.
We're talking about,
Well, the loan
The loan
receivable.
no annual
They
installment
requested
paid. Yeah, Mill Village Fire
They did
Department.
request it, but they weren't granted it.
No.
Oh, no.
It's only the people that requested it that got it.
Oh, only, so
The
they
two,
didn't.
okay, so the two bottom loans
Right.
are not paid by the fire departments to us, Mayor Norman. They come out of the equipment reserve that we put money into every year. The truck capital fund, that's where they come from. The top 3 are paid by check from the fire department to us. The bottom 2,
Oh, they were on the fire truck.
that are
They
part
were
of
part of
the,
that
yeah,
contract.
they come out of the truck fund every year.
Yeah, so when the original 2 cents for the fire department was set up, there was loans outstanding at the time. One was Mill Village, one was Liverpool, and it was agreed at the time that those loans would be repaid from that capital truck fund. So those are the 2, Liverpool and Mill Village. So that you show the balance of what's outstanding. So on the financial statement, you'll show there's a payment, about $26,000, I think, and that would be those two loans.
Out of the, they're not,
It's not coming from a check from them, that's just coming out of that capital reserve as part of that original 2 cents several years ago. So that's why they weren't,
right,
they weren't forgiven, because they need to be forgiven, the money was
because the money was
reserved.
already,
Okay? So let's go back to our B 23. So again, you'll see the column redeemed, that just means the payments been made, that's principal payments to all of us normal folk. Interest rates, very good, the debenture number, that's just an internal reference for us in accounting. Does anybody have any questions about our debentures? They live in the capital fund, because they were used to pay the capital things, like the streets, the sewer, so that's where you'll see the debt lives in the capital fund, long-term debt. Steve, you awake over there?
so we're only carrying $4.2 million.
That's correct.
Long-term debt.
Yeah.
Which is pretty.
That's
low.
really good. It's really good, and, we will definitely get a greenhouse for that. Yeah. Yes. All right. So, B 24, I always put, this is PSAS note, but I kept it in here. This is how much long-term debt we have to pay off in the next 5 years, and you'll notice, 2023 has a significantly larger portion there because we have that balloon payment, remember?
Oh, that's.
For water? Yeah. Yeah. Tax sale surplus, now, you know, we can only take the money from the surplus if it's, once it's been sitting there for 20 years. So we're gonna have a bit of a drought, because there was an 8-year basically drought in tax sales. So we'll have to wait until we get our hands on that $10,000 for 2010. And here is the capital asset notes that I talked about. I have 2020s on page B25 and 2021s on page B26. These include the utility plant and equipment. The bottom line is our water. What's the difference between this one and the one in the capital fund statement? B27, contracts and commitments. The contract for the garbage renewal, garbage collection, obviously, you guys talked about it in the meeting. It's gone up this year, $769,000 plus HST. The contracts for residual transfer of organic material, they don't have dollar amounts on it because it's based on tonnage. So we just put that when it expires. Both of them are relatively new. The remuneration note is part of PSAS, and it's something that I have to report to the province. We have a fire department funding note here, which basically says we have the 2 cents per year from the tax rate. And here we go with B28. Very important page. So, this is a detailed listing of all of our reserves. So this is all of our piggy banks. So let's start at the top. Second generation landfill, almost $4.4 million has been put aside, and it's been put aside to build a new cell. That's what that reserve is for, to build a new cell. Sewer projects, $826,000, pretty self-explanatory. Organic projects, $757,000. Is that the green bins? That's a lot of green bins.
Or if we ever wanted to look after our own organics or build something new, I think years ago, a new building was built, but that's a lot of money to have an organic reserve.
Yeah, it is.
The monies we put in these reserve, Chris or Joanne, or director, are we supposed to have it earmarked, like, for why we're building that much money in that reserve, for example, in the organic reserve? Should it be earmarked that is for a specific thing we're working toward, or just that it's to be used for organic? So if there was a piece of equipment that's used out there to move organics around, then that could be considered part of money taken on that organic reserve?
We would never know what we're gonna spend it on all the time. So it's just as Vito said, it's just a pocket of money. So sewer projects, we have a sewer reserve, but council decides every year what sewer projects we're going to do. It's not earmarked out 2, 3, or 5 years out, it's just, it's the amount. And so before any of the money that's designated there was to be spent on anything other than what's listed there, that would require approval of council to transfer that money out of that reserve. When you get into capital ones, those have more stringent regulations, but the operating reserves are pretty wide open. And so that's what's been designated by council as of March 31st as to what reserves are there and the allocations of them. But if council wanted to, for instance, get rid of the organics reserve tomorrow, they could. They just have to pass a motion to transfer it to some other location, some other reserve, recognizing that if you decide you want to build a new organics building out there, you're into several $100,000. If you need to buy new green bins for 6,000 properties, you're probably into hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that $700,000 is gone real quick. And that was the purpose of it.
Okay, no, I just wondered if there was any particular things in that.
Okay. Hillsboro Acres, so that we've got a reserve there, so at the end of the year, their little, if they make any money, this is where it gets transferred. You saw that they they had a surplus of $83,000 this year, so it went to their Hillsboro Acres reserve. We have $537,000 in our gas tax. That is at the end of March. I believe I put a list of the reserve balances as of the end of June, in the quarterly report. Did I? I did, didn't I? Yes. And I will be including that every quarter. And if there's any unbudgeted reserve activity, I will obviously, well, you will know because I would have already come to council. But just so you know, there's no secrets. Liverpool Business Development Center, $370,000. So remember earlier when I said, the expenses weren't what they were budgeted? There was expenses added. $70,000 last fiscal year, not the one we're doing now, but last fiscal year, was added to the expenses of the call center with the revenue going to this reserve. So that's why the reserve is so high. The
Expenses that were related to the call center.
It's just a number, darling, of me, Mayor Norman. It's a number. So there would be in accounting terms, there would be, expenses added to the statement of operations with the offsetting revenue put into the reserve, where there really weren't any expenses. The expenses were $5,000, but the budget was $74,000, so $69,000 was added to the expenses, and the rest was put it into the reserve.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So since we say that 370,000 was budgeted amount, but it would never ever happen, so to speak, or the expenses didn't line up to that. So it's saying that we have that much into that account?
Yeah.
So if we wanted to look at leaving it there, then we could be working on doing some work, or fixing it up for getting it ready for sale.
That's something that council would have to decide, yeah.
But that is there right now.
Right. Yep.
Okay, that's good to know.
Remember I told you about the 292,400 post-closure septic account that we had saying owed to local governments, and I moved it to reserve. Here it is. Okay. Pollution abatement, pretty self-explanatory. Queens Place lands, is that the 5% subdivision? No, that's the reserve for the
Sale land.
yes.
That's the money left over from the sales of the land.
Computer equipment, we have a small reserve for that. Parkland fee, that's that subdivision fee that people pay us if they don't put parkland. We have a fire department safety training equipment account, which is now reconciled to the penny, so we know exactly who we owe that $32,000 to. Recreation for All is a reserve that we have for, obviously subsidizing some recreational activities.
And that was all donated money.
Yeah,
correct?
that's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Fundraising, we have Queen's Place and the skate park, that's what makes up that $15,000. And we have a separate reserve now for the West Queens first responders training equipment, because I wanted to keep it separate from the fire departments, it's just better. And then the last one was NS Trip, and I'm not really sure what that is. We're gonna probably, come to council and ask to move that.
Yeah, that's transit, so we would have received money for a transit study a while back from the province, we wouldn't have necessarily spent it all, there would have been $1,000 left over, so it just sat there.
Yeah, okay. All right. Special capital reserve allocation. Now, this is gonna go back to, remember when I told you to remember about the $3.1 million liability, or $3.4 million that's on our capital fund? So, when we go to, value how much it's gonna cost us to close the landfill, there's some math that's involved. You have to take today's dollar and future value it at a certain rate, and then you have to discount it back to present day. So I'm going to try and explain this to you the best way I can. Because what I'm responsible for making sure is that we put away enough money today to pay for that closure 20 years from now, based on the capacity that's left in the landfill. So, for those of you who have grandchildren, I don't have one, but I'm gonna get one soon. So if I wanted to pay for my grandson's tuition, I wrote this out so I wouldn't forget. So tuition today is $10,000. So that would be like the closing costs, what the engineer says it's gonna cost us $10,000 in today's dollars to close that landfill. So today's tuition today is $10,000. So based on inflation of 3%, I can assume that in 10 years, my grandson is gonna need $13,400 to pay his tuition. But we all know that inflation is one rate and interest rate is another. So I need to know how much money I have to put away today, so that 10 years from now, I get that $13,000. So we future value the money at 3% inflation, and then we have to discount it back using today's interest rates, which are really low at 1.5. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to put in today $11,500 into a bank account making 1.5% interest, so that in 10 years, my grandson's gonna have that $13,000. That's what we're calculating here. That's what the accretion expenses, if they call it. So I'm taking today's dollars, and I'm saying, in 20 years, I'm gonna need X number of dollars, and then I have to discount that back to what I need to put in the bank today, based on the interest rates today, to get that money in the future. With me? Okay, great.
So that's not enough money.
Oh, but here's the kicker, darling. So we're having this all, we're bringing in a consultant at the end of this year to go over our landfill and to check all of our math and make sure all our capacities are right. So we'll be redoing this all next year. But if you look at the special capital reserve allocation here, we've got almost $5.2 million put aside to close the landfill. And according to the calculations that we've done this year, we only need 3.4. So right now we've oversaved what we need. The problem is that we make these calculations based on certain assumptions, based on that the inflation rate is gonna stay the same. Like, for example, this year we used 3.4. I looked ahead, it's now 11, because, the construction index has gone through the roof. So that's gonna make the accretion expense next year huge, probably gonna be $1.5 million at least, right? The point is that we have to look at these numbers carefully when we have independent opinions on what we decide to do. And we can't make decisions yet, because even though it looks like we have too much money, we need to know for sure we have too much money before we do anything drastic. And also, when we look at our investment policy, we're not gonna use that money for 20 years, so that will be some of the things that we look at investing. because we're not gonna need it for 20 years until the landfill is closed. Does anybody have any questions about that? You good? To simplify it, I did here, I said, if I wanted a chocolate bar and it costs $1 today, at 3%, it would cost me $1.34. 10 years from now, so I'd have to put $1.15 in the bank at 1.5% to have my $1.34 in 10 years to buy my chocolate bar.
Don't double.
Yeah, we're good.
I was just
Oh,
thinking of
God,
chocolate.
oh my God.
But
Which
based
one
on,
from a Snickers?
but based on the marketplace, in order to get the same size bar, chocolate bar, you probably have to put twice as much money because the bars are all getting
Right.
smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right, true.
Gee.
So the next reserve is special equipment reserve allocations, and that's part, remember I said that reserve pocket was split into three? This is our three, special operating, capital reserve, and equipment reserve. These are our three sections of the pocket. So in equipment reserve, we have landfill equipment, public works equipment, fire department capital trucks, water equipment, and airport equipment. So we have that all nicely split. I think I lost the rest of my stuff. Okay, so we're good with page B28. And again, if any of you have any questions later, just come see me and I'll be more than happy to talk to you about them. B29 is the pension that we talked about earlier. At the bottom is solid waste closure and post-closure liability. We just talked about that. That just gives you more detail on the capacity and things like that. So we're down to B30, same thing. Budget figures, we talked about the difference between what we budget and PSAS, what PSAS makes us put in here, so that's the difference there. Segment disclosure, that's when all the expenses have to be split per PSAS. So again, this disclosure note is a consolidated note. So you're not gonna see everything, everything's combined here, the reserves and everything is in here. So this number here, 59844, is equal to the surplus on the front, on the consolidation page. Not the surplus you see on the operating statement, that's why. And B34, we added a little note about the deferred revenue for safe restart funding for the province of Nova Scotia, 597.35. And then, of course, we get to my lovely little capital note at the end, which we've already talked about. Now that's the non-consolidated in a nutshell. Anybody have any questions?
It's a big nut.
It's a big nut. It's a good nut.
I think it's great that you've got your pencil sharp and we're putting monies where it should be and we're presenting a clearer picture.
Thank you. It's great. We're,
You know,
having
it
fun,
doesn't,
aren't we?
it doesn't, there's no way imply that any of us handling the
No.
funds, it just said maybe people were working too hard to get through the greenhouses.
Well, it's a different approach, right? So,
More clarity.
yeah. So the last thing we just have to zip over is the trust funds. They're also not audited. And, would you like to discuss? No, go ahead.
So, we just hold the six different bank accounts, we get quarterly dividends, and every year the scholarship committee decides based on what the requirements are, who gets those, so we can go there. And it's my Hillsboro Acres Trust, so there's still some residents that we handle, we receive their money, we pay both their invoices, and that's where the money is held.
Awesome. Now, I did prepare a small, summary report that, CAO McNeil has, and I'm sure if you would, if it's okay, I can circulate it to council, just some talking points. At the end, it says, the report to the audit committee from Grant Thornton found no adjustments or uncorrected misstatements or unadjusted non-trivial misstatement of disclosure matters. The draft independent auditor's report included an unqualified audit opinion that reads in part, in our opinion, the accompanying consolidated financial statements present fairly in all material respect the financial position of Region of Queens Municipality as at March 31st, 2021, and its results of operations, its changes in its net assets, and its cash flows for the year then ended in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. So we are good.
I have one question, Joanne. When we had the presentation from the auditors, there was a question at the end about the land at Trestle Trail.
Yes.
For ownership.
So what it was, we went back and forth.
Yeah.
And she consulted one of her, experts in the area, and it was determined that it was a repair. It wasn't, yes, we technically own it, but it was a repair because the agreements specifically state it's a repair.
Yeah.
And the Trestle Trail Association has taken over responsibility. So, and they're the ones that carry the insurance on it.
Right.
According to the agreement. And so that's why it's still that $924,000 on our statement of operations, includes the 487 for the Trestle Trail.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you. Yes, I had an almost heart attack there, but yes, it was all good. It all came out well in the end.
Okay. That's a non-trivial amount.
Yes, it was a non-trivial amount.
So we had made a motion regarding, adopting the audit financial statements, I believe, Christine, before we began. Yes? Yes, because they are being budgeted. So therefore, I see no further questions, I'm gonna ask a question on the motion, all those in favor? Contrary, approved. I believe it's time to take a break. How much time do council need to, grab something to eat and be back? 1 o'clock is 1:02 now, so we'll be back by 2:15. 2 o'clock. Okay, I'll call the meeting back to order. First item on this afternoon's agenda is appointment of fire inspector, 13.1. There is a recommendation to be made before we can discuss this. Councilor Charlton?
I move that the Council of Region of Queens Municipality appoint Tim Clattenburg as a fire inspector for Region of Queens Municipality to administer and enforce provisions of the Nova Scotia Fire Safety Act, regulations, and National Fire Code.
And that is seconded by Councilor Hawks. Mr. McLeod, Director of Planning and Development.
Yeah, as the Fire Safety Act requires that, fire inspectors be formally appointed by council. So this is, just a recommendation to have Tim, formally appointed as a fire inspector so he can assist with the carrying of those duties, under the act and the fire code.
Any questions of Mr. McLeod? Councilor Brown?
I guess it's safe to assume that he's taken all the courses at this point, or will he be like on an apprentice?
He's taken some, but under, the Fire Inspectors Association of Nova Scotia, there's no formal certification as of yet for
Okay.
fire inspector position, but, the act does require that, the municipality formally appoint
Okay.
those individuals. So, but he has taken some courses in those areas.
Okay.
Councilor Fancy?
Yeah, so we can have 2 fire chiefs. Is that what it is? Or
Fire inspector, that's right. Yeah.
So even if we wanted to appoint somebody else, if you could be able to do more than 2?
Oh, yes, it's a municipality, if you have a staff that, has the ability to do so, it's just, you're spreading out those duties among several individuals instead of relying on a single.
I'm just thinking of it as further, if you needed extra hands for doing all the work that they entail beyond that.
Well, that's, yeah, and certainly it's a combination position of the building official and fire official, so, I guess we have to judge the workload of those individuals.
Absolutely.
If additional staffing is necessary, then I guess we'll deal with that in the future.
Okay. I just wondered if it's possible.
Any other questions? No, I'll ask, Councilor Brown?
What percentage of their job would be taken up by fire inspecting? I know we're up 70% on inspections and stuff. Is it
These days, it's not as much as should be.
Yeah.
Just to do the report of the building inspection, so it's something we need to get caught up on.
Yeah.
So that's the additional formal appointment will certainly assist in that regard.
Yes, it'll help both of them spread the load a little bit.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No, question, all those in favor? Contrary? Passed. Item 13.2 deals with, some residents who've asked for the provincial government to name a formerly unnamed cove in LaBelle, specific name, province, oh, anyway, we'll have a motion there, and then I'll explain what the process was. Councilor Brown?
I move that the Council of the Region of Queens Municipality notify the province of Nova Scotia that it has no objection to the geographic naming of the cove on the southern side of Maliga Lake as Owl Cove.
Seconded by Councilor Charlton. Mr. McLeod?
Yeah, as far as the naming of geographical locations, that's, I guess the authority really resides with the provincial and federal governments. However, in the application process, the consent or the agreement of local government is requested as part of the application process. So, the individuals who made the application to the province, have made a request that the council support, the naming of this cove, to Owl Cove. So, staff of the municipality did have, some, I guess, participation in the process whereby we partnered with the provincial government in, I guess, as part of their application process. They're required to send out, notification and a survey to property owners, within the vicinity of the cove to get either their agreement or their disagreement with the naming. So we assisted with the mail out of the survey to the individuals. So we did have prior knowledge or involvement, with this application in the early stages. So essentially what they're looking for is just a acknowledgement or agreement that our council has no objection to this naming to Owl Cove.
It's interesting that, when they send their 125 surveys out, 13 people actually wrote back in support, and the other 112 are considered implied support, because they didn't say no, therefore the province takes that as implied support. Are you ready for the question? All those in favor? Contrary? Passed. And 13.3, there is again, recommendation in your package. Make that recommendation. Someone has to. Councilor Charlton?
I move as council region of Queens Municipality to declare property identified as PID number 700295117 as surplus to municipal needs and enter into a purchase and sale agreement with John Lake to convey the municipal lands for a purchase price of $3,000, and that all costs associated with this transaction be borne by John Lake.
And seconded by Councilor Romero. Again, Mr. McLeod?
Yes, as you're all aware, the municipality owns several parcels of land on Wolf Street, upon which there are mobile homes located, which are privately owned. John Lake currently owns the mobile home, which is located at 32 Wolf Street. And he has made application to the municipality to acquire the land upon which his mobile home sits. So the municipality has looked at similar requests in the past, and sold these quite small lots on Wolf Street to the mobile home owners. So $3,000 per lot is what was determined as fair market value several years ago when the municipality sold some adjacent lands. So it's reasonable that we can take that as fair market value in the sale of this parcel to Mr. Lake. So right now the municipalities are generating tax revenue from this parcel, so it's better served in private hands, and staff's requesting sale to the mobile home.
Any questions of Mr. McLeod? Hearing none, I'll ask for the question. All those in favor? Contrary? I'll begin. And reports. To Councilor information report. The council information report is in the back. You start seeing the motion start from the newest to the oldest. Any questions on any of those matters in that report? Councilor Brown?
I was down at Beach Meadows the other day and I saw the bench that was put up there.
Oh, good.
Very nice spot.
Is it toward the end?
Yeah, it's right at the very end, where the round turn goes.
Yeah.
It looks out over the creek where Carl spent a lot of time taking pictures, so it's a nice spot to get a good job on.
Nice to know. That one will disappear then. Any other questions? Councilor Fancy?
The ad hoc committee for the noise bylaw, do we have a meeting one for District One?
We had one late person apply Friday, and that will be put forward on our next agenda.
Okay.
Any other questions regarding the implementation report? Fire department funding, Ralph and Kevin. How do you wish to do this?
I'm gonna start and Ralph's gonna finish.
Okay.
Okay, so we're meeting with the chiefs and trying to come up with an agreement on the money that goes to the each department. Ralph and I had come up with one proposal and they didn't like it, so then they went to they come up with one themselves that they all agree with at this time. They can change it in the future, but they have to come back to us and change.
Do you mean they can change it for next year?
Yes.
But this will be,
This is this year's. If they want to change it next year, they have to meet and with themselves, with the chiefs, and then they have to agree on the change with that. The payments are gonna be the same as before, 50% of, then the 20, I'm not sure how it goes.
2020.
I think that's what it is. And they, like I said, they still have to provide the financial statements every year. This one's the money, the way that it is. Well,
So I've got a little report on this. The report is with reference to the allocation of fire services funding approved in the 2021-2022 budget. The funding approved in the budget was 2 cents of the tax rate, which equals approximately $190,576. The Emergency Services Committee met to review and discuss the allocation of the funds, and presentation was made to the fire chiefs, or part of the Emergency Services Committee. The fire chiefs did not agree with the presentation, and they met separately, decided how they wanted the funds allocated. Their calculations were referred back to the committee, which was, at that time, was just Kevin myself, and then they're now being presented to council. The fire chiefs have requested that the $190,576 be allocated to each fire department as outlined in the agenda, item number 14.2. The chiefs all agreed that a $40,000 minimum be set for each fire department to start with, and then the percentages for each fire department were calculated as per the needs of each station and agreed upon by the chiefs, and the dollar amounts were calculated accordingly. As the expenditures for each station far exceed the grant provided by the region, each chief will determine where the funds are to be spent based on the needs of their station. As per section 294 of the Municipal Government Act, the fire chiefs register their department with the Region of Queens each year, specifying the service that they will endeavor to provide and the level of service they will achieve. The registration also confirms that the department has equipment to perform the service specified. The fire chiefs know what they require to perform their duties, therefore it's their decision where the funds are required to fulfill their obligation. We as a council do not have the knowledge or skills to determine how this grant should be spent. To date, I have not been aware of any circumstances that fire departments have not fulfilled their duties to which they have been registered. Until there is an issue, I do not believe that council should be determining where the funds should be spent. I fully support the chief's request and agree the funds be allocated as they have requested. I move the adoption of my report.
A second.
Seconded by Deputy Mayor Muse. Any questions? Counselor Fancy.
So, if we accept the adoption of this report, and they all agree to this, the amounts that were given, I like that idea that a minimum of 40,000, it brings everybody up to a level playing field. But I really like that. The other end is that if they adopt this, and it says all of a sudden somebody next year says, oh, I don't like this, or I don't like that, we have what we have, they have to all agree upon it to make the change. It can't be just somebody being contrary, or somebody doesn't like what they like, it has to be all agreed upon to make any kind of a change, right?
May I respond to that, Mayor?
Yes.
My understanding is that the chiefs have agreed to this at this point in time. They want to run it for the rest of the year to see how things work for it. If it doesn't, they're gonna come back to the table and we're gonna discuss a new plan. Okay, so this is for now, and there's gonna be a trial period, obviously, and if it works, then it's great. Then everything will be status quo. If not, then we will entertain any changes.
I'd just like to make a note. You moved a motion, and you seconded a motion that is not in writing. You referred to a report we have not seen. Another counselor earlier today asked me a question about motions just being popped up, and my response was, any substantive motion, which is what you've made, needs 48 hours, and it needs to be written. I'm not disagreeing with what you've said, but we have not read the report. You read it quickly, and I believe as members of council, before we adopt such things, because you asked for a motion to adopt your report.
Right.
And there were statements in that report that I'm not sure if everyone agrees with. For example, if we adopt your report, then we are agreeing to statements such as, it is not council's business to tell the fire departments where to spend their money. Those were.
I did not, correction, I did not say that, Mayor.
What you wrote?
I said, we have, as council, do not have the knowledge or skills to determine how the grant should be spent.
I'm just not settled about the way the report came to council and the fact that we have a very substantive motion on the floor.
May I respond? This money has been approved in the budget, and all we're doing is allocating it. There's no new monies going out. This is what we agreed at the budget meetings. This is on our budget, and we're giving them the money that they're entitled to, or that we promised to give them.
So, we sent out the spreadsheet to everybody, I don't know, a week and a half ago, and it's been in the agenda. Really, we're moving to adapt the spreadsheet.
That's not what the motion read. His motion says adoption of his report, and he read a report that we have not read.
So where do we go from here then? We put this back on my report goes out and we put it back on the agenda
I would have
for,
been more comfortable had the motion said, I move we adopt the allocation of the funds rather than adopt the report that you've read. It's
okay,
two
may I
very
change, may I
different-
change my motion?
I disagree. We have it in the section as reports, and we were told that this is how we should bring it back to the council as a report, and then it would be accepted.
Well, then if that, do we need a motion?
You
If
have
this
to-
is how
you
the
have to
fire
adopt-
chiefs.
You have to accept the adoption of the report.
Councillor Charlton?
Do we need a motion attached to this? do we just give consensus, like, as in what Councilor Guinea said, this money was already allocated and approved with the budget, so does he actually need to present a motion here, or do we just need to give consensus that we're okay with it?
See, I have no problem with the charts and the way the money was allocated. I personally do not want to adopt those written words.
Okay,
Yep.
so then we can.
So I'll withdraw my motion.
I agree.
Thank you. Motion has been withdrawn.
And so do we need a motion for the expense of the funds, since they've already been, I mean, the other monies we give, in past years, when monies and tax increases have been given to fire departments, have they always come with a motion on how the funds would be dispensed or dispersed?
I can't speak to previous, I don't think I've been involved with that. I think the simple thing is, as Councilor Charlton said, it's just consensus around the table that all members of council authorize staff to release the funds that have been agreed upon, the the chart's 190,646, but it should be 190,576. Then you just authorize staff to release the funds according to the same schedule as we do the other funds, and that's the end. It's not a motion, it's just a consensus.
Yeah, because, I mean, I admire the work that you've done to get the fire chiefs to this point, and I'm fine with the dispersal, the way they required the money to be dispersed. I was just not comfortable with that report. Councilor Fancy?
And I agree with all the above, and my question would be, should it not be a motion though still to adopt the numbers that are here, just because if someone comes back as a fire chief and says, well, that's not the way I saw it, and then all of a sudden all we have is a nod here and nothing official, I'm just trying to say you have something on the books, this is what we adopted, and we accept it. Just as a question.
We have, emails from all the fire chiefs saying that they agree with the spreadsheet.
So we just need consensus. Is everyone in favor of the, Councilor Brown?
No,
Yeah.
I'm just agreeing that I'm in favor.
Yeah, so we're all in favor of this dispersal of these funds. Thank you very much for that. And Councilor Charlton. Sustainable Communities Training. So as we may recall, Councilor Charlton early on requested to take a course on sustainable communities. And as per the awarding of that, she's now ready to give a report on what she's learned that she can share with us.
Thank you. So nothing too long, I promise. I completed this course successfully, and I learned about what it means to make a community sustainable, and that was based upon social, economic, and environmental foundations. And I learned different tools and solutions based off of other Canadian municipalities, how you could implement programs and different things like that to help achieve sustainability. And it was very eye-opening and educational, and very quickly I was thinking differently. Within a week or two of that course, when we came to council, I was thinking about things that I wouldn't have thought about before, so it's definitely given me a different perspective, and I'm really happy that I had a chance to complete it, and I just want to thank all of my fellow councilors for supporting that training.
And thanks for that. Could you perhaps in a write-up share what you've learned, so we also can gain from what you learned?
Sure.
I think, would council be interested in that, to actually know several of the main points?
Yeah, I can
That would
highlight
help.
these things, for sure.
Perfect. And that takes us to an in-camera items. 3 items: sale of municipal property, contract negotiations. We need a motion to move in camera. Moved by Councilor Brown, seconded by Councilor Hawks. All those in favor? And we will move in camera.